Chapter 356. Geor Chapter 337. Reversal. Shea's tone and voice were deliberately deep and dignified. But in fact, what holy city of Babylon? What holy Roland's Garros? As for what the immemorial covenant was, he, Uncle Shea, didn't have the slightest clue. He just followed Dora's advice and spouted some nonsense, but he actually scared Mr. Peach. Mr. Peach's face was gloomy, alternating between green and white. He just stared at Shea without moving his eyes for a moment, as if he was hesitating and weighing something. Finally, after staring for a while, the old guy suddenly shook his head. No, you took Hastings all the way to the south, and the 2 Byzantium scouts were very happy and excited when I described your appearance. You're an officer of the Byzantine army, aren't you? You actually lied to me that you're a disciple of the Lord of Babylon? Humph, what a cunning boy! As he spoke, a sharp glint appeared in his aged eyes. Shea's heart sank. After being stared at by this old guy, he could not help but feel a little scared, but after all, Uncle Shea grew up in Wildfire Town. His cunning heart was the complete opposite of his rough appearance. When it came to lying, Uncle Shea was no less experienced than anyone else. He was forced into silence by Mr. Peach's words. Although he did not understand why Dora asked him to pretend to be a disciple of the Lord of the holy city of Babylon, he at least understood one thing. It seemed that Mr. Peach was very afraid of the identity he was pretending to be. If he really believed it, he would not dare to do anything to him. Uncle Shea was not afraid of death. Although he had a cunning temperament, it was only because of his intrepid nature that he had struggled through the laws of the jungle in the mountains and forests. Coupled with some adaptability that had been nurtured in Wildfire Town, he was not afraid of death. When he really had to fight with his life on the line, he, Uncle Shea, wouldn't go soft in the slightest. And now that he had fallen into the enemy's hands, he absolutely couldn't do such a cowardly thing like kneeling down and begging for mercy. However, begging for mercy, your father, won't do it. Telling lies to deceive you, old bastard, to death is not considered as me being afraid of death. Lao Tzu was not afraid of death, but he would try not to die if he could. Immediately, meeting Mr. Peach's blade-like gaze, Shea was slightly startled, and then he suddenly opened his mouth and laughed heartily towards the sky. His laughter was full of energy, without a trace of nervousness, and without the slightest bit of guilt. Such a hearty laugh was full of vigor. Instantly, in Shea's laughter, Mr. Peach's sharp gaze wavered. What are you laughing at? Sure enough, the old elf was fooled. Shea breathed a sigh of relief in his heart, but the smile on his face disappeared. His face tightened and he slanted his eyes. He didn't look at the old elf, and only snorted coldly. His voice was full of disdain and contempt, and the expression on his face clearly showed that he was too lazy to explain to you. If Shea had opened his mouth to explain, Mr. Peach might not have been fooled, even if he had said a lot of things. But it was precisely this disdainful appearance that frightened Mr. Peach. There was no other reason. It was just that Master Shea's imposing manner was too self-righteous. He lied so confidently. It was no wonder that he had been nurtured by a smiling old man for so many years. Mr. Peach's eyes flashed, and thoughts flew in his mind. The human emperor's descendants have a venerated status. All the tribes abide by the treaty and will never interfere in Babylon. But this bloodline of the ancient human emperor has been circulating for thousands of years. Although they keep saying that they will never get involved in worldly affairs, but, who would really believe such words? They have an extremely noble bloodline, the understanding and indulgence of all the major races, a lofty status that transcends the continent, and a top expert like Saint Roland Garros in every generation. Although on the surface it seems that Babylon never gets involved in worldly affairs, but in fact, thinking about it carefully, in the past thousands of years, whether it was the rise and fall of the continent's human race in China, or the rise and fall of one great empire after another, behind those history, there might be the shadow of this human emperor's descendants. A transcendent status outside the continent. Transcendent? This kid in front of me seems to be a disciple of the Lord of the Holy City. But he used the identity of the Byzantine army to hide in the secular world. Could it be that the human emperor's descendants couldn't help but interfere in the confrontation between the two great empires of the human race? It was no wonder that this old elf was deceived. It was because Shea's acting skills were too damn good. His skin was extraordinarily thick, and that level of shamelessness really benefited from the teachings of that smiling old guy. More importantly, he could even talk about the human emperor's descendants, the immemorial treaty, these extremely secretive things. His tone was understated, as if he knew them like the back of his hand. If he wasn't a disciple of the Lord of the Holy City, how could he know these secrets? In addition, the two crystals in Shea's hands could cut through space. Such a good item that was close to a divine item. It must be made by a super-powerful person like Saint Roland Garros. With all these factors combined, Shea's lie actually managed to deceive this old elf. Mr. Peach's expression changed again, and he finally calmed down. He took 2 steps back, clasped his hands behind his back, and looked at Shea, who was lying on the ground. His eyes were gloomy, and he smiled gently. "All right, I believe you. I won't kill you." Shea's heart was moved, but he didn't dare to show any joy or complacency on his face. Instead, he narrowed his eyes to hide the light in his eyes. "But your life can't be spared," Mr. Peach sneered. "I won't kill you, but I naturally have a way to take your life." Saint Roland Garros' abilities are extraordinary, and I naturally don't dare to guess. But no matter how I leave, even if I attach a strong divine thought to you, it's not omnipotent. As long as you don't ask me to kill you, you can't blame your death on me. As he spoke, he smiled gently, squatted down, and reached out to pinch Shea's chin. When Shea opened his mouth, this old fellow had already stuffed a strange item into Shea's mouth. A cool and soft item, unknown to him, was placed on Shea's tongue. Instantly, he felt a burning sensation fill his stomach and rush to his brain. Mr. Peach released his hand, and Shea immediately tilted his head, and spat out the item on his tongue with all his might. It fell to the ground, and surprisingly, it was a leaf. This leaf was only as wide as 2 fingers, and as long as a finger. It was as thin as a piece of paper, and the patterns on it were clear, but it looked as if it had withered to the extreme. Originally, there was still a little bit of green on it, but after it fell to the ground, it quickly withered, and in a short while, it turned into a rotten leaf. Shea only felt the burning sensation go down his throat and into his stomach, and then quickly spread throughout his body. Mr. Peach walked to the side, and took out a green pouch from his bosom. He used his finger to pick out a gray ointment, and then went to Hastings's side, and stuffed it into his mouth. Finally, he also stuffed a green leaf into Hastings's mouth, and then took it out. That green leaf also became withered. Shea opened his eyes wide and looked at Mr. Peach. "You," I said, "I won't kill you because I can't kill you, but if you die in the hands of others, you can't blame me." He pointed at Hastings. "You and him both have to die." The old elf's lips curled into a cold smile. Hastings drank the Hieronymus spring water, and is already a poison man. Most of his strength has already been devoured. Although I don't know what method you used to relieve the poison in his body. I think it's just some stupid method of letting out blood. That's good, leaving him alive. I can borrow his blade to take the lives of both of you. As he said that, he slowly stepped back. I gave him a medicine that can temporarily relieve the poison in the Hieronymus spring water. But it's only a temporary relief. Once he wakes up, his strength will recover a lot. Furthermore, the 2 leaves that you have swallowed are not ordinary leaves. To put it bluntly, in a while, you will lose your consciousness. At that time, you will become monsters that only know how to kill, without any sense of reason. The 2 of you should have a good fight and then perish together. Shea's heart turned cold, and he immediately thought of the two marmots used to test the poison on the road. After they mutated, they went crazy and tore at their own kind. He became anxious. Shea might not be afraid of death, but if he turned into another crazy monster, he definitely wouldn't be willing. Thinking of this, Shea immediately struggled with all his might, but his whole body was exhausted. He twisted and turned on the ground, but couldn't get up. Don't struggle. The more you struggle, the faster the effect of the medicine will take effect. Mr. Peach laughed loudly, and his figure quickly floated back. Shea struggled for a while, and sure enough, he felt his head gradually become dizzy, and his consciousness gradually blurred. However, in his heart, there was an indescribable ruthlessness boiling from the bottom of his heart. It was like a ball of fire was spreading in his consciousness, burning his heart and making him anxious and fidgety. He felt more and more negative emotions surging out. Although he tried his best to calm himself down, that monstrous anger and irritation engulfed him like a tide, fiercely attacking his line of reasoning again and again. Finally, Shea couldn't endure it any longer, and opened his mouth to let out an "ah" sound. This was originally a subconscious groan, but the moment he opened his mouth, the groan immediately turned into an angry roar. After the roar, it turned into an extreme roar. The remaining consciousness in his heart also faintly felt that shouting like this was a little inappropriate. However, after he shouted out loud, the swelling feeling in his body that felt like it was going to explode, as if the evil fire in his chest that had nowhere to vent had suddenly found a way to vent. This feeling was indescribably comfortable. This feeling couldn't be stopped. Shea seemed to have gathered all his strength to roar, and in the end, that voice had completely lost all rationality. Listening carefully, it sounded like a crazy beast. He lay there, his whole body twisting and struggling. Although he felt that his 4 limbs were weak, the weakness in his body was burning him unbearably, as if it was about to turn into a force and explode, but he couldn't use it. He twisted and struggled more and more, and his movements gradually became bigger. In the distance, Mr. Peach had already floated into the air, looking down at Shea from afar and coldly laughed. "It's useless, I've placed a magic seal on your body, sealing your strength. Now, no matter how much you roar, you can't use any strength. In a while, when you and Hastings get up together, my seal will automatically undo itself, and the two of you will recover your strength at the same time, then you can have a big fight." Ha 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 ha. Shea opened his eyes wide, and his eyeballs were covered with thin blood vessels. From afar, it looked as if his eyes had turned scarlet. The muscles on his face were completely twisted, and there was no trace of life in his eyes. He was like a bloodthirsty beast, without a trace of his original consciousness. Mr. Peach floated in the air, and his expression carried a trace of malice. "You destroyed my guardian beast, so you naturally asked for this punishment." Shea rolled and struggled on the ground, and gradually, he was able to sit up. Mr. Peach saw this and was slightly puzzled. He actually still has the strength to move? It seems that this guy is not simple. While he was surprised, Shea, who was on the ground, suddenly jumped up from the ground like a fish. He jumped up several meters high. In midair, he stretched out his body, clenched his fists, and opened his arms. Pa, 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 a few crisp sounds rang out, and suddenly, a few faint chi patterns appeared in the air around Shea's body. It was as if he had broken free from the invisible shackles that had been placed on his body. The sounds were as dense as raindrop. Shea struggled to open his arms and roared at the sky. He was actually floating in midair, and didn't fall. Mr. Peach was completely stunned, and his expression was as if he had seen a ghost. He stared at Shea and exclaimed, "Impossible! How did you break my seal? You should have lost your mind." In the distance, Shea slowly retracted his open arms, and placed his fists in front of his eyes, and then opened and clenched them. When he raised his head, his eyes no longer had that violent look, but had regained a kind of cold calmness. However, it was visible to the naked eye that a faint red halo was floating around his body like a mist. So painful. Shea's eyes revealed a trace of astonishment. Looking at his hands, he muttered, "This is power?" He suddenly smiled. His eyes were clear and there was no longer a trace of ruthlessness in them. Although the skin on his chest was hurried, and he was panting violently, Shea raised his eyes and looked into the distance. "Mr. Peach, what kind of drug did you give me that makes me crazy and bloodthirsty? It will turn me into a monster that only knows how to kill?" Pausing, Shea smiled lightly. "I originally thought that I didn't have enough killing intent. To condense and cultivate more killing intent, I was still worried about how to do it. So," as soon as he finished speaking, his whole body shone with a red light, as if the sun was shining down. His whole body whistled, and like a comet in the sky, red flames covered his whole body. In an instant, he was in front of Mr. Peach, and in a few steps, his nose was almost touching the tip of Mr. Peach's nose. Shea made a face, but Mr. Peach's whole body was already trembling. He could clearly feel the soaring killing intent from his opponent, and it was suppressing him to the point that he couldn't move, and his whole body was sweating profusely. Boom! A fist fiercely smashed into Mr. Peach's abdomen, causing him to curl up like a shrimp, and his body was sent flying high into the sky. With a twist of his body, Shea disappeared from where he was standing, and when he reappeared, he was more than 10 meters high in the sky. At this time, Mr. Peach's body, which was sent flying, had just reached Shea's side. Shea let out a long roar, and his foot fiercely kicked Mr. Peach's chest. With a few cracking sounds, a piece of Mr. Peach's chest caved in, and a lump of black blood spurted out from his mouth. His body was like a falling meteor, smashing fiercely to the ground. With a dull sound, a shallow pit appeared on the ground. Shea, however, was standing in midair. He stretched out his right fist in front of him, opened his 5 fingers, and then slowly clenched them, a strange look flashing in his eyes. "Power! This is a power that I have never had before, this feeling." Shea suddenly laughed. "This feeling is not bad." His laughter was filled with madness and joy, and with a whoosh, his body descended from the sky, landing beside Mr. Peach on the ground. Poor Mr. Peach, with his strength, he might not have been beaten so badly, but Shea's sudden change caught him off guard, not to mention, this change was caused by him, Mr. Peach. After being hit twice by Shea in a row, Mr. Peach's mind was unsettled. After being hit twice, no matter how strong Mr. Peach was, he was heavily injured. At this moment, he was lying on the ground, his mouth and nose full of blood, and several bones in his chest broken. His breathing was unstable, and he couldn't even stand up. Shea landed beside him, looking down at Mr. Peach, and sneered, "I know you are very surprised. Actually, I am also surprised. I also didn't expect this to happen." You, Mr. Peach gasped, and forced himself to open his mouth, but he couldn't say a complete sentence as he stared at Shea. The moment he opened his mouth, blood mixed with saliva spurted out from his throat. His eyes were filled with anger, shock, and unwillingness. "Since you want my life, I won't be polite with you." Shea pursed his lips, and a cold light flashed in his eyes. He lowered his head and retrieved the 2 crystals from Mr. Peach's body. Then, with a smile, he grabbed Mr. Peach's neck and lifted him up. "You must really want to know what is going on, right?" Shea moved closer and stared into Mr. Peach's eyes. "Because, to me, killing intent doesn't make me lose myself, but it is what I need the most. So." He exhaled lightly, and the fingers around Mr. Peach's neck suddenly tightened. A cracking sound was heard. "Thank you. I didn't disappear this weekend, but I have to say that tomorrow, maybe, I won't be able to update. This time, it's not to accompany my girlfriend, but to work. Tomorrow, I will leave for Shanghai for the Authors Forum meeting. So, if there is no update tomorrow, please bear with me. but the update the day after tomorrow is guaranteed. Yep, that's it. Little Five hugged his head and ran away in a sorry state. Sigh, I don't want to either. I already received a lot of resentment for not being able to accompany my girlfriend this weekend. To be continued. If you want to know the future, please go to www.chidian.com, support the author, support the legal reading. Chapter 357. GOR Chapter 338 Become Stronger? After throwing the corpse on the ground, Shea immediately bent down and carefully searched Mr. Peach's body. This old thing was an elven mage. He must have a lot of good things on him, right? After carefully searching for a while, he found a scroll. Looking at the texture, it was not paper or animal skin. Looking at the lines, it seemed to be some kind of tree bark. However, it was much more flexible than paper or animal skin. The surface was densely packed and curved, and all of them were words that he couldn't understand. Presumably, it was the language of the elves. This is the elves' nature magic. It's just some spells. Dora immediately answered Shea's doubts. It won't be of much use to you. You are not an elf, you can't use elven magic. Shea sighed and casually put it into his bosom. Then he took out a small bag from Mr. Peach's body. Inside were a few leaves rolled up with ointment and the like. This old thing seemed to be very good at poisoning. Shea was not sure what these things were, so he did not dare to touch them. Other than that, there was nothing else. Not even a magic ring or any magic equipment that he could wear, not even a single thing. Shea couldn't help but feel a little disappointed when he had just debuted. He had brought a group of people to slay a dragon and had also obtained a wind travel ring. That equipment could be used to escape, but it was a useful tool. But this Mr. Peach, who was an elven high-level mage, did not even have a decent item on him. Shea could not help but feel discouraged. Then he suddenly remembered that when he was fighting with this old thing, he could casually pull out swords, magic wands and the like from his sleeves. Could it be that there was something special about his robe? Uncle Shea did not care so much. Without any hesitation, he took off Mr. Peach's robe and looked at it for a while. With his magic attainment, Shea did not have any magic attainment at all. Since he could not see anything, he might as well roll it up. Taking it, he ran to the side of the road and threw it into the carriage. Fortunately, it seemed that Mr. Peach had not discovered the entrance to the carriage. On the other hand, Todoro and Irenti were still unconscious. After a careful examination, Nye Yen found that the two of them were only unconscious. However, what made Shea furious was that the two cavalry scouts were already dead. Shea was infuriated. He carried the two cavalrymen to the side of the road and carefully placed their corpses. Then, he ran back to Mr. Peach's corpse and gave it another 2 kicks. Although these cavalrymen under his command were originally Ney's horse gang, after being incorporated by him, he had once led these people to conquer and recover Metter City. Then, he led these cavalrymen to go to 3 counties and instigate Odin's Scarlet Snow Army to fight against the warlords in the Empire. During this period, everyone had gone through fire and water together. In the army, they had already established a comrade-in-arms relationship. How could he not be angry when 2 of his subordinates were killed in front of him? With Shea's temperament, he took out his fiery fork and chopped the old bastard's body into 8 pieces to vent his anger. Don't be in a hurry to get angry. There are more important things. Dora reminded Shea. Hastings is going to wake up soon. You reckless fellow, you shouldn't have killed this fellow so quickly. Hastings has also been poisoned by the berserk poison. He is not like you, who has cultivated the crimson murderous aura and can transform these violent and murderous thoughts into murderous aura and power. When he wakes up, you will be in trouble. Shea's heart skipped a beat and he could not help but feel a little regretful. However, when he thought of his 2 cavalrymen being killed by the enemy, the regret in his heart immediately dissipated. He ran back to the carriage and took out the packages of ointment that were wrapped in leaves from Mr. Peach's body. Everything is here. There must be an antidote inside. Do you have any way to identify it? Dora smiled bitterly. I am a dragon after all, not an elf. I don't know much about these things that are made from natural plants and elven magic. Shea frowned and walked to Hastings's side. Looking at the sleeping Hastings, he frowned and said, Let's just treat a dead horse like a living one. If you don't know, I don't know either. At least you know a little. I can only scratch my head in confusion. If I can save him, I will save him. If I can't, Lao Tzu won't let him down. As he said this, he threw a package on the ground and opened it. Which one is the antidote? Dora was silent for a while before she finally smiled bitterly. I'm starting to suspect that you want to take this opportunity to kill him. Shea snorted. I want his life. I can cut off his head with my fiery fork now. There's no need to go through so much trouble. As he said this, he became silent and waited for Dora's instructions. Dora seemed to have hesitated for a long time. In front of so many different kinds of ointment, she seemed to have weighed the pros and cons for a long time before she said, The third package on the left, I remember that Mr. Peach took out some and gave it to Hastings. He said that it could temporarily relieve the poison in his body. This thing is useful, you should keep it first. Shea immediately put away the package. Hastings was poisoned by Hieronymus Spring. This was a medicine that could relieve the poison. If he kept it, he might be able to use it to blackmail Hastings in the future. In addition, as for the medicine that makes people crazy, I thought about it for a long time. It's most likely a spring water that I heard about. That spring water is very strange. I've never seen it before, only heard about it. As for the toxicity, I can't guess it. However, the law of all things always has a counter to each other. I heard that the spring water that makes people crazy has a special characteristic. There are a lot of magic kiss taro growing next to the spring water. Magic kiss taro is a magic plant used to extract the negative emotions in a person's heart. Since it grows next to the spring water, I think it might be able to restrain the poison. Magic kiss taro? Shea's heart immediately moved. He may not recognize other magic plants, but he is very familiar with the magic kiss taro. When Todoro went through the Magic Union's trial, he was asked to find the magic kiss taro. In the end, they found it in the Jack tribe. Take a look and see if any of these ointments are made with the magic kiss taro. If there is, it's most likely the antidote to the poison that makes people crazy. Dora's words are very reasonable. Shea immediately stood up and ran to the carriage to pull Todoro out. Todoro is only unconscious. After being pushed a few times by Shea, he slowly woke up. When he opened his eyes, Shea grabbed his clothes and shouted, There's no time to talk nonsense. Quickly take a look and see if any of these ointments are made with the magic kiss taro. You are a magician, you should be able to recognize it, right? When Todoro woke up, he was originally full of questions. But before he could say anything, he was forced to do something by Shea. His mind was in a mess, but when he saw Shea's anxious look, he didn't dare to ask more. Fortunately, although his magic strength is low, he still studied in the Imperial Magic Academy. His basic knowledge of magic theory and magic potions is very solid. After identifying the ointments, he quickly pointed to one of the ointments. This one. There is the magic kiss taro in this ointments. Before he could finish his words, Shea grabbed him and lifted him up. At this moment, Hastings is lying there. Although he is not moving, his eyelids are trembling and his breathing is getting faster. Obviously, this is a sign that he is about to wake up. When Shea lifted Hastings up, he saw Hastings's Wu Ran open his eyes and stare at him. Shea forced a smile. You're awake. Hastings's eyes were looking at Shea. His eyes, which were originally blank, suddenly flashed with a strange light. Shea held the ointments in his hand and was about to stuff them into his mouth. Suddenly, Hastings's hand pressed down on Shea's chest. With a boom, black-colored flames suddenly surged out. Shea cried out in pain and his body flew backward. After taking the hit, Shea fell to the ground. When he got up, he opened his mouth and spat out a mouthful of blood. How powerful was Hastings's resplendent flames! Not to mention, at such a close distance, it had directly struck his chest. Hastings got up on his own. His face was gradually contorted as he held his head with both hands. His whole body trembled and he appeared to be in great pain. Roar, roar sounds came from his mouth. Hurry! He has not fully recovered. Seize the opportunity and force it down his throat. There was no need for Dora's reminder. Shea had already pounced forward. His body moved like a raging wind, and he pounced forward like a tiger, pouncing down on Hastings to the ground. Although Hastings had just woken up and was still in a state of confusion, he was able to instinctively react. The two of them hugged each other. Before they even landed on the ground, Hastings's fists had already shot toward Shea's chest area. At such a close distance, Hastings's attacks were fast and ruthless. Shea grunted in pain as he took two hits. Thankfully, his reaction was not slow. He reached out with his hand to grab Hastings' arm. The two of them landed on the ground and rolled back and forth 3 to 4 times. However, they had already exchanged over 10 blows. Hastings's attacks were extremely ruthless. At such a close distance, his target was Shea's eyes or throat. Shea tried his best to block the attacks. At the same time, he viciously punched Hastings' head. Hastings was clearly dizzy from the attacks and his movements slowed. The frenzied and ruthless light within his eyes seemed to recede slightly. Shea took the opportunity to flip over and press down on top of Hastings. He shouted, "Open your mouth! I am saving you!" Hastings took a punch to the head and his consciousness blurred. Instantly, the frenzy within his heart subsided and he regained 30% of his consciousness. He subconsciously opened his mouth. Shea knew that he had to seize the opportunity. He quickly shoved a lump of ointment into Hastings' mouth. However, Hastings's consciousness only lasted for a moment. Once the dizziness in his mind subsided, his eyes once again shone with an ominous light. Shea was stuffing a lump of ointment into Hastings' mouth when he suddenly saw Hastings' expression change. Shea quickly retracted his hand. However, it was too late. He cried out in pain and jumped far away. "Damn it! You actually bit Lao Tzu's finger? I will kill you!" Hastings flipped over and stood up. He was panting heavily. Although he had lost his consciousness, his abilities had not disappeared. With a long shout, he raised his right hand and waved it. In the distance there was a loud bang. A black light suddenly shot out from the carriage and broke through the carriage. It landed in Hastings' hand. It was his tri-edged war spear. With the spear in his hand, Hastings' body suddenly erupted with a monstrous amount of black-colored chi. Shea saw that the situation was not looking good. Before Hastings' spear could reach him, he quickly jumped backward. His body was almost touching the ground as he rolled backwards, schwa. A lump of black-colored chi brushed past his head. After Shea landed on the ground, he held the flaming fork in his hand. He straightened his body and looked at Hastings. "Son of a bitch! Didn't you take the medicine? Why are you still acting so crazy?" "Idiot, there is a process for the medicine to take effect," Dora quickly said. "Besides, we are just trying it out. Whether or not the medicine is right and whether or not he took too much or too little, there might be a problem." Shea wanted to listen to what Dora had to say. However, Hastings had already rushed over with his spear. The tri-edged war spear swept forward with a black-colored light. Shea could only brace himself and raise his flaming fork to block the attack. Red and black-colored light burst out at the same time and the two of them began fighting. This was not the first time that Shea had fought with Hastings. Not to mention, Hastings had also sparred with Shea before. Once the two of them began fighting, it would be difficult to determine who would win. Shea knew that he was no match for Hastings. However, he could only force himself to fight back. After fighting for a while, Shea became more and more shocked. In the end, even he himself was stunned. Why? The two of them had been fighting back and forth for over 10 times. However, the situation was very different from the previous fights between the two of them. Hastings was actually beaten to the point where he was unable to fight back. The two of them were entangled. In the beginning, Shea was still defending with all his might. However, after a few exchanges, he was surprised to find that Hastings's attacks were not as strong as he had expected. Regardless of speed or power, they were not as strong as before. He was only using 70% of his energy to defend. However, he was still able to divert 30% of his energy to counterattack. After a few more exchanges, the situation gradually became 50-50. Whether Shea was attacking or defending, he appeared to be evenly matched with Hastings. After a few more exchanges, Shea became even more unstoppable. His Annihilation Thousand Army and his Crimson Killing Intent caused everything within a few meters to be covered in red light. Hastings's resplendent aura was suppressed to the point that he was unable to turn the situation around. In the confrontation between the two of them, Shea was practically suppressing Hastings. Hastings could only move his spear back and forth, barely managing to block left and right. He was completely suppressed by Shea's attacks and did not even have the ability to counterattack. Shea was stunned. Had Hastings become weaker? Or had Lao Tzu become stronger? To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 358. GOR Chapter 339 repeated over and over. The absent-minded thought flashed through Shea's mind, and he quickly recovered. Hastings had indeed become weaker. However, he himself had also become stronger. In the past, when he sparred with Hastings, the most valuable reference was when Hastings gave him pointers during their sparring session. Hastings's strength was far superior to his. Back then, Hastings had assessed him to be only at the level of a level 7 or 8 warrior. If he were to utilize the dragon thrust, he would be able to instantly rise to level 9. After that, he first absorbed Hastings's resplendent aura and successfully transplanted the Crimson Killing Intent into his body. After completing the fusion, both his body and strength received an upgrade. After that was the great change just now. Although Shea was still unable to fully grasp the situation, he was able to roughly understand that Mr. Peach had lifted a rock and smashed it on his own feet. What kind of poison did he use on me that would cause me to go berserk? In the end, it ended up helping me. My Crimson Killing Intent had instead received a great leap forward. Now that he was fighting Hastings, he could clearly feel that the Crimson Killing Intent had increased his mental strength. Regardless of whether it was his reaction, vision or movements, they were all faster than before. Under the effects of the Crimson Killing Intent, Hastings's unpredictable movements and ferocious moves no longer seemed so miraculous. His reaction speed was now able to keep up with his opponents. In fact, it was even faster. The characteristic of the Crimson Killing Intent was that it would instantly increase his mental strength, causing the enemy's movements and moves to appear slow in his line of sight. Thus, he could easily grasp the enemy's weakness. In the past, when he was fighting Hastings, his strength was insufficient and the Crimson Killing Intent was clearly not good enough. However, that situation had now been reversed. He had truly become stronger. As for just how strong, at any rate, he was now able to suppress Hastings. Of course, Hastings had also become weaker. Since the start of the fight, Hastings's performance was still as valiant and tenacious. In fact, it was even more ferocious. But from the beginning to the end, he only displayed the standard of an advanced warrior. To be more precise, He didn't display the slightest hint of the realm of an expert. It was as if Hastings had degenerated into an ordinary top martial artist. Perhaps this kind of strength was already very strong. At least in the past, even if Hastings didn't use his realm, he could still beat Shea up. But now he obviously couldn't do it. After understanding this layer, Shea's spirit was immediately aroused. The fiery fork in his hand suddenly danced like a rainbow piercing through the sun. The red light in all directions was like rolling waves. Layer by layer, it rolled around Hastings. That set of annihilation of 1,000 armies move was displayed without restraint. Seeing that Hastings was suffering under his hands, being beaten by him to the point where he could not fight back, he could only barely support himself in a battered and exhausted state. He even screamed like a madman. Shea was secretly pleased in his heart. Son of a bitch! Back then, when you bullied me, you beat me up as if I was your son. Now, it's finally Lao Tzu's turn to vent this anger. Finally, Shea's fiery fork struck the triangular war spear. With a bang, Hastings was unable to hold on to the spear. The spear flew up into the sky. The dignified Hastings had his weapon knocked away by Shea. Shea felt even more carefree in his heart. He laughed heartily and was about to say something. All of a sudden, Hastings stood there, his eyes flashing with a strange light. He was still as violent as before, his face filled with irritation. His eyes were red and filled with murderous intent. But at this moment, it was as if a strange anger was born out of all these emotions. It was cold, but boiling. Hastings no longer had a weapon in his hands. His hands were empty and he stood there motionless. It was as if he had been stunned. Shea was about to retract his hand when his heart suddenly sank. An incomparably powerful aura radiated out from Hastings's body, suppressing Shea to the point of being unable to breathe. The powerful aura was like boiling water splashing snow, directly disintegrating Shea's aura into nothingness. In that instant, Hastings made his move. His figure merely raised his hand slightly. In the next instant, he appeared right before Shea. This was no longer just pure speed. This was teleportation. Space itself was distorted. Before Shea could react, Hastings's hand had already tapped his chest. Bang! Shea immediately sprayed out blood from his mouth. A large hole appeared on his chest and a mist of blood sprayed out from his back. His entire body was pierced through in an instant. Next, he lost his fiery fork and was sent flying. Damn it, this is not fair. How did he become the strong in the middle of the fight? Shea thought to himself with grief and indignation. Hastings's sudden awakening was enough to knock down Shea. However, just as he was about to rush forward to give chase, Hastings's body suddenly shook violently. His entire body trembled violently. The aura that he had just unleashed was suddenly like ice melting away, quickly dissipating away. The black-colored flaming aura around his body suddenly dimmed. Shea fell to the ground. Receiving such a heavy blow, this blow was not a light one. Such a heavy injury was practically fatal. If Hastings were to rush forward and attack him again, there was no need for him to be too heavy. Just a normal attack would be enough to send Shea straight to the 9 Springs to find that smiling old man. Shea's heart was filled with regret. There was only one thought in his mind. Lao Tzu had survived through so many storms and waves. Yet, he was casually killed off by Hastings? After falling to the ground, he could no longer move. He could only close his eyes and wait for death. But after waiting for a while, his body's strength recovered bit by bit. Hastings's next attack did not come. Shea opened his eyes. The huge bloody hole in his chest had already healed at a rapid speed. Fortunately, Todoro brought the frog with him. Demandras was in tears. He struggled to take a few breaths. The blood in his chest had stopped. His muscles and bones were quickly healing. Shea managed to turn over and sit up. However, he saw Hastings standing in the distance. His hand was still in the same position as before, but his body was trembling uncontrollably. Was the Hieronymus Springs poison acting up? Shea's heart suddenly skipped a beat. Indeed, Haramoto Momo had given Hastings some medicine to alleviate the effects of the poison, but Hastings had already been poisoned for many days. Even if he had the medicine to alleviate the effects of the poison, his strength was already limited to the level of an ordinary person. After fighting with Shea for a long time, Hastings, who was unable to exert the power above the strong, was actually completely suppressed by Shea. Even if Hastings had lost his nature and was full of murderous intent and violence. But don't forget, he was still Hastings after all. As the martial god of Odin, Hastings was arrogant. How could ordinary people compare to him? Even if he had lost his consciousness, he was still firmly suppressed by the enemy in a fierce battle. Even if he had lost his consciousness in his subconscious, the proud Hastings absolutely could not tolerate such a thing happening. Therefore, the pride of the strong caused him to forcibly activate the power of the strong and directly beat Shea to the ground with one blow. But because he had forcibly used the power of the strong, the poison of the Hieronymus spring in his body could no longer be suppressed and erupted. Seeing Hastings kneeling on the ground with a plop, Shea did not care about the pain on his upper body. He hurriedly ran over and supported Hastings. The rage on Hastings' face gradually receded, and the redness in his eyes faded bit by bit. Finally, a trace of sobriety appeared in his eyes. Shea immediately breathed a sigh of relief. Thank God! It seemed that the magic kiss taro ointment had worked. Hastings pursed his lips. Although his whole body was in severe pain, he raised his eyebrows and his voice was still cold and arrogant. Humph! Not bad, you've improved. Clearly, after regaining his consciousness, Hastings still remembered the battle between the two of them. Shea quickly helped him sit up. Then, he gave him some of the antidote that could alleviate the poison of the Hieronymus spring. This is from Mr. Peach. Shea fed him some. It can alleviate the poison of the Hieronymus spring. After swallowing some of the antidote, Hastings smiled bitterly. Not bad. It's better than letting out blood. Although he was smiling, there was a deep haze between his eyebrows. After all, he was a dignified, peerless expert, a powerful expert. But now, he was firmly restrained, unable to display his heaven-defying abilities. Once he did, the poison would immediately flare up. For an expert like him, losing his strength was worse than death. Shea's heart relaxed. He thought that the storm had passed. Then, he helped Hastings to sit down. He also picked up Hastings's tri-edged war spear and handed it over to Hastings. He was about to give him some medicine. Hastings's face suddenly sank. His hand loosened and the tri-edged war spear fell to the ground. He roared out, both hands clutching his head as he shouted, "My head hurts." After saying that, he flipped his body up high only to fall heavily to the ground. He struggled back and forth on the ground for a moment. Shea, who was standing beside him, watched on with a dumbfounded expression. He quickly moved forward to hold him down. However, just as his hand was about to touch Hastings, Hastings suddenly shouted out and sent a backhand punch at him. Shea had only just dodged when he heard Hastings's distorted voice. I can't control myself. His series of roars brought with it a hint of madness. Shea's heart sank. Could there be something wrong with the medicine? When Hastings flipped himself up again, there was no longer a look of sobriety on his face. Instead, there was a look of madness on his face. He bared his fangs and brandished his claws as he pounced toward Shea. Shea sighed inwardly. All he could do was to twist his body and fight Hastings. This time, neither of them used any weapons. However, it would appear that Shea's punches and kicks were stronger compared to Hastings's. In just 7 or 8 exchanges, he was able to throw Hastings away. However, Hastings quickly fell to the ground. Without waiting for Shea to come over, black-colored chi burst out from his body once more. Shea cried out inwardly. Not good. As expected, the powerful aura once again radiated out from Hastings's body. Shea saw a black silhouette flash before his eyes. With a booming sound, blood sprayed out from his mouth, and he was sent flying once more. Damn it, he's using the power of the strong to bully people again. Shea flew far away and sat on the ground. Before he could get up, he saw that Hastings had already clenched his fists and collapsed on his own. Shea spat out another mouthful of blood. Subsequently, Hastings regained consciousness again. However, the poison had flared up and Shea could only give Hastings some relief medicine. This time, Shea had learned to be smart. He had already guessed that there was something wrong with the antidote. Perhaps it was the wrong medicine, or perhaps he had taken too much or too little. In short, something had happened that caused Hastings's consciousness to fluctuate between sobriety and madness. This time, he did not dare to get close to Hastings. Once Hastings took the medicine, he would immediately stay far away. Sure enough, within a moment, Hastings went crazy again. Then it repeated again. Shea could only force himself to fight with Hastings. He won first and then lost. Every time Hastings would suddenly erupt with the power of the strong at the last moment and severely injure Shea in one move. Then he himself would faint due to the poison acting up again. After repeating this 3 times, Shea collapsed. No more fighting! No more fighting! Shea was furious. Hastings had already punched 4 bloody holes in his body. When Hastings went crazy, he was really ruthless. They would all be fatal moves. Fortunately, his power of the strong could only be used once. The poison would act up after death. Otherwise, even if Shea had 3 or 5 lives, he would be dead now. After Hastings collapsed for the 4th time, Shea's face was full of distress. Do we still need to wake him up? Do you have any more of the magic kiss taro ointment? No more. Shea sighed. It seems it is not that he didn't eat enough. Rather, he ate too much. Back when he was saving Hastings, Shea had been afraid that he would not eat enough medicine. Thus, he had stuffed an entire pack of Magic Kiss taro ointment into Hastings's mouth. Now that he thought about it, he must have eaten too much. At present, every time Hastings woke up, he would go crazy. If this were an ordinary person, it would not be a big deal. But the problem was that this was Hastings. He was a fellow of the strong. If he were to go crazy, he might just kill Chen Xiaoyan. Gritting his teeth, Shea walked over and fed Hastings some medicine to alleviate the effects of the Hillgate poison. This time, after Hastings woke up, he opened his eyes. However, Shea quickly jumped away and stared warily at Hastings. Hastings's face was extremely ugly to behold. After waking up, he could still remember what happened when he went crazy. He shouted with a hoarse voice, "Shea, have your subordinates leave immediately. If I were to go crazy and attack them instead of you, I fear that I might end up killing them." Shea quickly nodded his head and had Todoro quickly pull the car away. Seeing that his life was at stake, Todoro, damn it, he ran faster than anyone else. If Shea had not ordered him to pull the car away, he would have pulled out his flying carpet and run away. Seeing Todoro pull the car away, Hastings's face flickered again. The corners of his eyes twitched and his voice turned hoarse. Something is wrong with me again. He was gasping for breath. Clearly, he was forcefully using his willpower to suppress his crazy emotions. His eyes seemed to have turned red as he stared at Shea. You must be able to knock me down as fast as possible before I use the strength of a strong expert. Shea smiled bitterly and said, I want to, but I am not strong enough. When you are not using your power, I can suppress you. However, I cannot defeat you quickly. Hastings took a few deep breaths and the muscles on his face contorted even more. Then, he squeezed out, my move weakness is... right? He quickly listed out a few weak points, but Shea was dumbfounded when he heard it. At this moment, Hastings roared angrily and went berserk again. Shea sighed in his heart. Just as he was about to fight, Dora suddenly said, "If you don't want to fight, can't you run? Idiot." Run? Shea immediately understood in his heart. Yes, if Lao Tzu didn't want to fight, couldn't he run? He looked at Hastings, who was pouncing on him with his triangular spear, and glared at him. Then Uncle Shea turned and ran. As long as Hastings didn't display his power, he might not be able to catch up with Shea in terms of running speed. Seeing Shea turn and run, Hastings roared and chased after him. The two silhouettes headed south, one in front and one behind. Shea walked in the mountains all year round, so his running speed was naturally fast. Hastings chased after him with all his might, but he wasn't satisfied. The distance between them was only a few dozen meters. Even if Shea tried his best, he could only maintain the distance between them. After running for a while, Hastings suddenly shouted from behind. He stopped, holding his spear, and looked blankly at Shea in front of him. He said loudly, "Don't run." When Shea heard Hastings's words, he knew. Damn it, a while had passed again. He turned around and saw Hastings standing there, looking blankly at him, and then at the fire fork in his hand. There was a faint look of grief and indignation in his eyes. A great expert like him had been reduced to such a state. He couldn't even use his power easily. No wonder he was so angry. "Come here." Hastings suddenly gritted his teeth, as if he had made up his mind. His eyes flashed as he stared at Shea. He said in a cold voice, "Come here. I don't have much time. Looking for recommendation tickets, looking for monthly tickets today. I just came back from Shanghai by train. After I got home, I started writing without stopping. It wasn't easy, dear viewers. Please give me some recommendation tickets, monthly tickets, and the like. By the way, the later part of the story is about to reach its climax at the same time. The most exciting part of the Byzantium War is about to arrive. This country bumpkin will officially stand in the center of the stage, to be continued. If you want to know what happened next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 359. This chapter has 7,000 words. GOR Chapter 340. The consequences of taking the wrong medicine. Shea hesitated for a moment before quickly moving to Hastings's side. "Hand it over." Hastings stretched out his hand with a stern expression. "What?" "The crystal left behind by teacher," Hastings said with a wry smile. "You still have a big one in your hand. I have seen it before. Hurry up and take it out." Shea had already guessed what Hastings wanted to do. Without hesitation, he pulled out the biggest remaining crystal and handed it to Hastings. Hastings held it in his hand and raised his eyes to look at Shea. Then, he suddenly sighed softly. "I don't know if it is my bad luck to meet you or if I owed you something in my previous life. Humph, at any rate, I ended up letting you take advantage of me." After saying that, Hastings waved his hand. Then, he quickly bit his right index finger. Blood dripped down from his finger as he tapped the black and swarthy stone. A clump of black chi quickly emerged from his face. As the black chi flared up, the stone in his hand seemed to have been injected with light. The originally black stone began to emit a faint red luster. The black chi flared up around Hastings, and the finger he tapped the crystal with became a red stream of water. Following his actions, the originally black stone seemed to have become filled with something. It became increasingly bright and translucent. Its originally turbid color gradually turned translucent. Shea stood to the side and watched. His heart pounded wildly and he blurted out, "You?" Hastings's face was filled with misery and he sneered. "I sealed my own power. However, I needed to first weaken myself. Otherwise, how could I seal it? Only you bastard got away with it." At first, the cold sweat on his forehead only appeared in small droplets, but in the end it became several lines of water that began to flow from his forehead. It was as though he had just been fished out from the water. Back then, teacher left this thing for you and injected his crimson killing intent into it. I am doing the same thing today. Hastings shook his head. His voice became more and more hoarse, as if he was running out of strength. This resplendent chi flame is given to you. To you, it is also an extremely, extremely, extremely good opportunity. Although my resplendent aura is inferior to the crimson murderous aura, it is still my teacher's ultimate technique. The power I've given you is a seed. As long as he could absorb it, take root in his body, and fuse it with his body, he would be able to cultivate a new resplendence. That's fine too. If I really die in the future, teacher's ultimate technique can be considered to have a successor. By the time he finished speaking, his face was already rapidly turning yellow. In the end, Hastings opened his mouth and shouted. His body leaned back and threw the stone to the side. He was already lying on the ground. At this moment, Hastings looked extremely weak. Even his aura had become very weak. Take it back. Hastings opened his mouth, and blood flowed out from the corner of his mouth. Take it back. I've already cut out some of the resplendent power seed for you. Take it back. If I really can't do it, you can kill me. Shea picked up the crystal that had already turned into a ruby. He was stunned for a moment. However, he was unable to say anything. Hastings's head of black hair was faintly turning white. Hastings gasped for breath. Suddenly, the expression in his eyes changed. He seemed to be showing signs of going crazy. He gritted his teeth and fiercely punched his own chest. With a wah sound, he spat out another mouthful of blood. Only then did he become a little more clear-headed. He quickly tore off his clothes, revealing his chest. He lowered his head and stared at it for a moment. Then, he took a deep breath. He raised his finger again. This time, a trace of black light quickly condensed at the tip of his finger. After the rapid condensation, it gradually condensed into a line. It was like a sharp black needle. Shea looked at the black needle in his hand and immediately understood Hastings's idea. What are you shouting about? Hastings held the needle and said in a low voice. This stab of mine has sealed my power. For at least 1 year, even if I want to unseal it, I can't. Within 1 year, my strength can only be displayed at the level of an ordinary high-level martial artist. The power of an expert is out of the question. Actually, Shea hesitated for a moment. Actually, why are you doing this? Even if you go crazy, you can just kill me. Humph. Hastings glanced at Shea. You think that because of that promise, I am not willing to kill you and would rather harm myself? After saying that, Hastings no longer looked at Shea. Instead, he suddenly raised the needle and stabbed it into his own heart. With this stab, Hastings opened his mouth and let out a low roar. Suddenly, a clump of black light sprayed out from his mouth. Above his heart, at the place where the black needle had pierced, several faint rays of light burst out. Hastings's roar spread far and wide. It was sharp and mournful, nearly causing the clouds in the sky to disperse. Shea, who was standing to the side, suddenly felt his ears tighten. The piercing sound caused him to feel dizzy, and he could not help but take a few steps back. Hastings loosened his grip and his hand slowly drooped down. The place where his heart was pierced had quickly healed, leaving only a thin black, my power has been sealed. Even if I go crazy, your current ability is enough to suppress me. Besides, I am also doing this to save my own life. If I were to use the power of an expert again, I would end up poisoning myself to death. After saying that, Hastings's face suddenly changed. He sat there and laughed out loudly 3 times. Then, he roared out 3 times and abruptly stood up. He raised his hand and grabbed the 3-edged war spear beside him. The expression on his face was one of insanity as he stared at Shea. Then, he suddenly laughed out wildly. Ha 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 ha. Kill, I will kill you. Shea's heart ached. He knew that Hastings had lost his mind once more. All he could do was to quickly retreat and pick up the flaming fork to block the attack. After a few exchanges, Hastings, who had just exhausted all the blazing aura around him, was knocked down by Shea. Shea hurriedly fed him some ointment. Seeing that Hastings had fallen asleep, he let out a sigh of relief. Up until now, the ointment that could alleviate the toxins in the Hieronymus spring had all been used up. However, Hastings's actions were quite foresight. He had sealed his own power so that he wouldn't be poisoned to death. Using only the power of an expert, with his physique and the amount of ointment he had taken, there wasn't much of a problem. This time, Hastings didn't wake up for a long time. Shea didn't dare to leave and could only sit to the side and wait. He waited for more than an hour. Previously, Hastings had only woken up after a short while. As time passed, Shea felt more and more uneasy. This Hastings wouldn't die just like that, right? He tested Hastings's breathing and found that his breathing was steady. It seemed as if he had just woken up from his coma. Shea sat to the side and waited for a long time. His heart was filled with apprehension. Finally, after almost 3 hours, Hastings suddenly took a deep breath and opened his eyes. He turned over and sat up straight. His face seemed to be covered with a layer of frost. In the beginning, there was still some confusion in those eyes, but gradually, they became clear bit by bit. However, no matter how one looked at it, his eyes were strangely cold. What made Shea feel even more strange was that this time, Hastings didn't immediately go crazy after waking up. Instead, he just sat there and stared at Shea with his cold eyes. Shea couldn't see any emotion in his eyes. Shea felt a little creeped out by Hastings's stare. He asked from afar, "Hey, how are you?" There was a hint of concern in his words. No matter what, in order to not kill him, Hastings would rather seal his power. Hastings sat there and strangely rubbed his head. Then, he looked over and blurted out a short sentence. "Shea." Shea was stunned. "Eh? It's me." Then, he jumped up. You didn't lose your memory, did you?" Hastings gave a harumph. "How could I lose my memory? Naturally, I can recognize you." He slowly stood up and looked at the tri-edged war spear beneath his feet. Then, he raised his hand and gripped it. Shea, who was far away, immediately got into a fighting stance. He watched as Hastings stood there quietly without attacking him. After a while, he said, You don't want to fight anymore?" Hastings glanced at Shea and said nothing. At this moment, the situation had become extremely strange. Back then, when Hastings woke up, he had immediately gone crazy and wanted to kill. This time, however, after waking up, he had calmed down. Could it be the medicinal properties of the magic kiss taro have finally stabilized? Shea sighed. He could not help but sigh inwardly. If he had known that the medicinal properties of the magic kiss taro would have stabilized so quickly, he would not have sealed his own power. Damn it, this Hastings is really unlucky. After standing there for a moment, Shea turned to look at Hastings from afar. He was still uncertain. Did you not go crazy?" Hastings gave a harumph and looked at Shea. "What do you think?" He looked at Hastings's clear eyes. They were no longer as desperate as before. However, the clear light within those eyes was strangely cold. Hearing that, Shea hesitated for a moment. Then, he slowly took 2 steps forward. "The antidote of the Hieronymus spring can only temporarily relieve the poison in your body. You had better not use any more power. Since you have regained your consciousness, then after taking 2 steps forward, he was now only 3 steps away from Hastings. There was a look of suspicion in his eyes as he asked, "Are you really all right?" Hastings rubbed his forehead and shook his head. "I am all right. I am fine." Seeing that Chen Xiaoyan had not gone crazy, Shea finally felt relief. The hand that was holding onto the flaming fork dropped down and he smiled. Then, I am relieved. If I had known that you would recover so quickly, then just now, after saying that, he took 2 steps forward. It was at that moment that a chilling light flashed out from Hastings's eyes. He instantly twisted his body and charged forward. The tri-edged war spear in his hand burned with black-colored flames. Like a viper, he viciously thrust the spear toward Shea's throat. This attack came so abruptly that the distance between the two of them was already less than 2 steps away. At such a close distance, Hastings only needed to raise his tri-edged war spear for the tip of the spear to reach Shea's throat. The tip of the spear had almost touched the skin of Shea's throat. With such a sudden change, even though Shea's strength was already quite formidable, he was still caught off guard. The skin on his neck could almost feel the coldness of the spear tip. The black flame aura was already burning in front of him. A mass of black flames had already rolled up to his shoulders and throat. Under the black flames, the front part of Shea's clothes suddenly turned into pieces and fluttered in the air. Hastings was clearly conscious. Yet, he was able to launch such a sneak attack on him. Shea was completely dumbfounded. At this moment, the powerful instincts that he had honed since he was a child reacted and saved his life. His body instinctively leaned back as the tip of the spear brushed past Shea's face. The tip of the tri-edged spear had already cut open a wound on his chin. The wound was as deep as a finger. Not only did it cut open his chin, even his lower lip was nearly sliced off. His waist bent backwards, almost bending his body into a 90-degree angle. The salty blood from his cut lips had already flowed into his mouth. Shea had never been so close to death. Hastings's tri-edged war spear was just a hair's breadth away from piercing his throat. After instinctively dodging the spear, Shea quickly regained his senses. He brandished his flaming fork fiercely. Cung! Sparks flew in all directions as the tri-edged war spear was knocked away. Next, he turned his body and rolled away from the tip of the spear. With one hand on the ground, he used the momentum to straighten his body. By then, he was already 4 to 5 steps away. Hastings's attack missed. However, his spear was already sweeping forward. Suddenly, black chi filled the air. Shea desperately tried to block it. Then, he jumped several meters away. Hastings was already thrusting forward with his spear. Amidst the black chi, it was impossible to tell how many spear tips there were. Shea's heart was filled with fear. After all, he had nearly died just now. However, the other half of his heart was filled with anger. Hastings, you have clearly regained your senses. Yet, you still dare to sneak attack Lao Tzu? Brandishing his flaming fork, the red light spilled out. Shea shouted, Hastings! What are you doing? Hastings's face was cold. The spear in his hand stabbed forward again and again. His mouth was cold as he said, What am I doing? Naturally, I am going to kill you. Can't you see that? His tone was cold to the extreme. However, it carried a tone that Shea found unfamiliar. Shea was both shocked and furious. He dodged Hastings's spear and shouted, Why are you going crazy? After saying that, Shea's heart skipped a beat. He looked at Hastings's cold eyes and recalled Hastings's cold tone. His mind instantly lit up. Hastings was not awake. He was currently going crazy. However, for some unknown reason, this time, Hastings's madness was different compared to the previous times. He was no longer like a wild beast that would recklessly attack. There was no consciousness, only instinct. This time, however, it was as though he had become a different person. He appeared to be sober and calm. However, his hostility and desire to kill did not diminish in the slightest. He resisted with all his might for a while. Fortunately, even though Hastings had gone crazy, he wasn't able to display too much strength. His tri-edged spear was impenetrable, but he still couldn't reach the realm of an expert. In the beginning, Shea had only wanted to resist for a while. He wanted to wait for Hastings's madness to pass and for him to regain his rationality. However, this fight went on for a good half an hour. The two of them exchanged blows and clanged against each other for a long time. Hastings's spear skills did not fall apart in the slightest. Instead, his moves became more and more exquisite. Shea was gradually finding it difficult to resist. As time passed, Hastings did not show any signs of waking up. He simply pursed his lips and aimed his spear at Shea's vital points. Worst of all, Shea found that he was gradually unable to defeat Hastings. Even though Hastings had not unleashed the power of an expert, Shea was gradually finding it difficult to resist. His heart grew increasingly vexed. Then, he heard Dora's voice in his mind. "I know. It's the magic kiss Taro's problem." "What?" Shea was furious. "What problem?" "Magic kiss Taro. That is a magical plant that can absorb a person's consciousness and emotions. You've given him too much. Although you've sucked away a lot of manic components, you've also sucked away some of his own consciousness. That is what caused his current temperament to undergo a huge change. Right now, he has neither gone crazy nor is he calm. Rather, his temperament has been changed by the magic kiss Taro." Hearing that, Shea sweated profusely and shouted, "Hastings, what are you trying to do? Do you still remember what happened just now? Son of a bitch, do you really want to kill me?" Hastings's tri-edged spear had gradually suppressed Shea's flaming fork. He stared coldly at Shea and said, I don't know why, but looking at you, I feel more and more disgust. I just want to kill you and, that's right. Kill you. No matter who it is, kill them all. Kill them all. Shea, son of a bitch. It seems Dora was right. This medicine cannot be taken carelessly. Shea blocked another 2 attacks. Suddenly, he felt a stinging sensation on his shoulder. Hastings's spear had stabbed into his left shoulder. If he had not dodged in time, another hole would have appeared on his shoulder. Shea felt helpless. However, he heard Dora's voice in his mind. "You are no match for him. Earlier, you were able to suppress him because he had lost his consciousness when he went crazy. He could only attack you based on his instincts. But now that he is awake, his temperament has changed. Although his strength is still the same, he is able to display 100% of the subtleties of his martial skills. Your strength is now equal. However, he is Hastings after all. His attainments in martial skills are much higher than yours." Shea shook his head. What do you think we should do? What else can we do? Either you defeat him, or you'll be killed by him, or you can run." Without waiting for Dora to finish her words, Shea viciously hacked Hastings's spear away with his flaming fork. Then, he turned around and ran. He ran from north to south. After the great change in Hastings' temperament, Hastings was still the same Hastings. However, it was as though his temperament had changed. He simply stared at Shea and chased after him. Shea stopped several times to fight with Hastings for a while before continuing to run. After fighting with Shea many times, Hastings' mind seemed to have become clearer. It seemed as though he had finally remembered many things. The two of them fought at least 10 times. Hastings clearly had the upper hand. However, he had sealed most of his power. Although Shea could not defeat him, running away was not an issue. Hastings seemed to have recalled the crystal in Shea's hand. In the end, he roared out, demanding Shea to return the crystal to him. How could Shea be willing to do that? He was no longer a match for Hastings. Return the crystal to him? Let him absorb the power of the resplendent flames inside? He did not know how badly he would be beaten up. One fled while the other chased. They ran from north to south for who knows how many days and nights. Although Hastings was no longer crazy, his calmness made him even scarier. No matter how Shea ran, no matter how he tried to set up formations, no matter how he tried to take detours, No matter how he tried to climb over mountains, he could not shake off this fellow. The two of them gradually ran from the north to the south of Moore County. Then, they charged into Ilton County, which was occupied by Odin's men. Shea even deliberately ran toward Corsica's military region. Even so, he was unable to escape Hastings' pursuit. After running for so many days, Shea was so tired that he was on the verge of vomiting blood. Hastings, on the other hand, seemed to know when to stop. After running for a while, the two of them tacitly stopped to rest. Then, they would fight for a while before continuing to run. Shea cursed inwardly. This Hastings was not crazy. Instead, it was as though he was possessed. He was chasing after Shea like an irreconcilable enemy. He was actually chased all the way through Moore County, Ilton County, and all the way to the south. Hastings did not give him the slightest chance to catch his breath. Along the way, the two of them took breaks to fight. After fighting, they continued to run. Shea had not eaten a mouthful of hot food for many days. Often, he would run into a forest, grab a handful of fruits, and stuff them into his mouth. Sometimes, he would run into a village and grab some food. Then, he would eat it as he ran. In the end, Shea could no longer endure it. After fighting Hastings for the 13th time, he shouted, "Damn it! You are possessed and insist on taking Lao Tzu's life. Lao Tzu will accept it. Who told you to eat too much medicine? I am the one who gave you too much medicine. However, even if you want to chase after me and kill me, you should at least give me time to eat." Unexpectedly, Hastings pondered for a moment before putting away his flaming fork. He nodded and said coldly, "Fine. Every day we will rest, eat, and drink for an hour. Unless you hand over the crystal and return my power. Then, hand over your head. Otherwise, even if you flee to the ends of the earth, I will not let you go." Shea wanted to cry, but no tears would come out. What the hell is going on here? Thankfully, the daily chase would free them up for at least half an hour for them to eat and drink. Thus, a strange situation occurred. After chasing for half a day, Shea suddenly shouted for a stop. As long as Shea did not run, Hastings would stop chasing him. The distance between the two of them was about 10 meters. After eating and drinking, Shea would break into a run and Hastings would continue the chase. After a few more days, the two of them gradually reached the southern border of Ilton County. Ilton County had been occupied by Odin's Scarlet Snow Army. However, these days, the Scarlet Snow Army and the rebel army of the Corsica military region had an internal strife. A large number of the Scarlet Snow Army had been mobilized to the Corsica military region to fight. There were very few Odin's garrison in Ilton County. The two of them chased all the way and did not encounter any of Odin's garrison. Finally, on the 10th day of running, a mountain forest appeared in front of him in the distance. Shea was happy in his heart. The mountain forest was not small. If he could run into it, then with his ability as a hunter, once he entered the mountain forest, wouldn't he be like a fish in water? Although he could not completely shake off Hastings, Shea had fully experienced Hastings's chasing ability along the way. This guy must have been a scout in the past. However, in the mountain forest, there was always a chance for him to widen the distance between the two of them as much as possible. He ran with all his might into the mountain forest, leaving behind billowing smoke and dust as he ran. Suddenly, he saw a few silhouettes standing in the forest. One of them was tall and had a head of messy hair. He was jumping around and screaming at him. His voice was clear and sharp, but he was shouting things like "country bumpkin" and "help." Looking closely, Shea was also surprised. Poor thing! Adeline saw Shea rushing in front of her and thought that she was saved. However, she saw the man in black chasing behind him, holding a tri-edged spear. Shea turned around and fought with the other party. Black flames and red light reflected off each other. Adeline was already stunned by what she saw. Even though she did not know any martial arts, she could always tell the difference between good and bad. Shea and the guy who was chasing him were fighting together. The movement, the scene. Country bumpkin, this country bumpkin, when did he become so powerful? As she said this, Adeline was already pinching the corner of her clothes, desperately twisting it. Her fingers were a little white. She stared at Shea, who was in the middle of a fierce battle. She did not know whether to be happy or surprised. On the other hand, Bobov Dax, who was standing next to her, had a surprisingly gloomy face. Seeing the two people fighting fiercely, his expression became more and more gloomy. With his insight, how could he not see that the strength displayed by these two people was at the top level of martial arts in the world? Experts of this level, even if he searched all over the continent, it would be rare to find one. However, two of them suddenly appeared here. Of course, the most important thing that made Dax's face darken to the extreme was Shea's shout before the fight. "Hastings, do you think I'm afraid of you? Hastings! 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 This kid is Shea? He is the long-legged girl's lover. But that man in black is actually Hastings. Odin, martial god Hastings. Shamelessly begging for votes, recommendation votes, monthly votes, everyone please reward me. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen, please go to www.chidien.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 360. GOR Chapter 341 The Last Hope, 9,000 words. The other three watched on as the battle between Shea and Hastings reached its climax. The two of them fought faster and faster. In the end, in Adeline's eyes, she could only see a black and a red shadow crisscrossing back and forth. At the same time, the sounds of intense collisions could be heard. The red and black shadows were entangled together, flying up and down. In the end, it was almost impossible to tell them apart. The only thing that could be seen was the red light and the black flame. It was a beautiful sight to behold. Adeline watched the two of them fight intensely. However, in Dax's eyes, he had a different thought. Dax's own strength was not bad. Seeing the two of them locked in battle, Hastings brandished his tri-edged war spear. Naturally, there was a domineering aura that faintly carried with it a thunderous movement. On the other hand, Shea's flaming trident glowed red. His killing intent soared to the sky. His moves were also wide open. It was obvious that this was an extremely high-level group combat martial skill. Especially when their weapons clashed from time to time, the sound of metal clashing could be heard. The power contained in each of their moves was astonishing. Dax's eyes narrowed into a line. However, his heart was in turmoil. Sometimes he would look at Shea. Sometimes he would look at that Hastings. In the end, a strange light suddenly flashed through his eyes. Shea and Hastings fought for a long time. The two of them seemed to be fighting intensely. Every move they made was earth-shattering. One moment of carelessness and blood would splatter on the spot. But in reality, the two of them were not as intense as they appeared to be. Not for any other reason, but because along the way, the two of them had been chasing and fighting at the same time. In total, they had fought more than 10 times. They knew the strengths and weaknesses of each other's martial skills like the back of their hands. After fighting for more than 10 times, the two of them did not hold back and brought out all of their skills. At this point, the two of them had exchanged more than 10 moves. However, Shea and Hastings already had a rough idea of how the battle would progress. Whichever move they made, the other party would react accordingly. Whichever move they made, it would be the other party's weakness. In fact, whenever they made a move, Shea would begin to be unable to resist. After that, it would be the end of the battle and Shea would have to turn around and run. However, in the eyes of the spectators, the two of them were evenly matched. Only Shea knew that despite his words of not being afraid of Hastings, if they were to continue fighting, he would be defeated after more than 10 moves. During these days of running and fighting, although Shea was in a difficult situation from being chased, he had actually benefited a lot. The level of martial skills that Hastings could display now was just a little bit higher than Shea's. It was not much, but it was not little either. The strength of the two of them was almost equal. Hastings was better than Shea. It was nothing more than the battle experience that he had accumulated through hundreds of battles, as well as the degree of understanding of martial skills. During this battle, in the beginning, Shea could only hold on for more than 10 moves. Later on, he improved slightly almost every time. This principle was like playing chess. If you want to improve your chess skills, you must have a suitable chess partner. This chess partner's level was lower than your own. Of course, it would not be good. However, if it was much higher than your own, it might not be of any use. In this way, it was not much, not little. It was better than your own by a little bit, but it could allow you to make the greatest progress in actual combat. Now, Hastings completely met this condition. His current strength was only a little bit higher than Shea's. During the duel, although Shea could not win, he still had the ability to protect himself. In a temporary situation where his life was not in danger, after fighting with Hastings for more than 10 rounds, he naturally learned a lot of battle experience and skills from Hastings during the battle. Moreover, his set of Army of Destruction was broken up by him during the battle. He did not know how many times he had performed it over and over again. This was different from his usual solitary practice. This was real combat experience. After hundreds of times of using it, his understanding of almost every move of the Army of Annihilation had deepened by a lot. Finally, the two of them fought for a while. Shea himself felt that this time, he could hold on for a little longer than last time. In the end, after being forced into a dead end by Hastings's 3 consecutive spears, Shea could only make up his mind. In an instant, his eyes glowed red. He let out a long roar and pointed his fiery fork. With a boom, the red light on the fiery fork suddenly became like a torch. A thin red light shot out quickly. Once the dragon thrust was performed, its power doubled in an instant. Facing Shea's strongest move, Hastings could not directly resist it. He could only take a step back. He waved his tri-edged war spear and quickly retreated. At the same time, the tip of his spear quickly pointed out a black flame to block in front of him. This move of the dragon thrust forced Hastings to retreat 7 or 8 steps before it was completely neutralized. According to his previous experience, Shea was already exhausted after performing this move of the dragon thrust. Next, he could only turn around and run again. Then, it would be a cycle of chasing again. But this time, after Shea's dragon thrust forced Hastings to retreat, his whole body's strength was immediately exhausted. In a situation where his strength was insufficient, he retreated 2 steps. He was thinking quickly in his mind. I actually met Adeline here. Then, I can't run away. But if I don't run, I'm not Hastings's opponent. While he was hesitating, with Shea's character, if he really wanted to go all out, he could only grit his teeth and fight Hastings to the death. But at this time, a loud shout came from the side. Shea, I'm coming to help you. As soon as his voice fell, Shea turned his head and saw the man who had been standing next to the pitiful worm just now, waving a pair of strange-sized scissors and jumping in front of him to help him block Hastings, who had turned around and rushed over again. Hastings was calm and unafraid. Seeing someone come to interfere, he only sneered. He held his spear with one hand and flew forward. The tip of the spear came down. Dax raised his scissors and with a caw sound, the scissors clamped down on the tri-edged spear. With a caw sound, Dax's hands shook. Although his scissors were sharp, how could they cut Hastings's tri-edged spear? This time, the tip of the spear touched the middle of the scissors. Hastings's seemingly casual attack was somewhat unbearable for Dax. His feet sank into the ground and his whole body seemed to shrink a bit under the tip of the spear. You're courting death. Hastings had figured out the depth of his opponent with one strike. He sneered and pulled back his spear, then thrust it forward again, and fiercely stabbed forward. Dax's head was covered in cold sweat, but he gritted his teeth and held onto the scissors. Seeing the spear fiercely stabbing towards him, he knew that he was too weak to block it. He could only quickly wave the scissors and hit the tri-edged spear 3 times in a row. Only then did he barely manage to knock the spear askew. His whole body had already rolled to the side, barely dodging Hastings's attack. With just one exchange, Dax's heart was clear. His strength was a level higher than his opponent's. Dax miserably dodged, then immediately turned his head and shouted, "What are you waiting for? Attack together!" Shea stared blankly. Although he had used up a lot of his stamina and the dragon thrust had already consumed most of his strength, seeing that someone was helping him, he still charged forward. For a moment, the two of them were fighting Hastings, barely managing to turn the situation around. The two of them were working together against Hastings, barely managing to fight to a draw. Moreover, it was Hastings who had the advantage. Dax's body was already injured. After fighting for a while, the wound on his chest that was originally covered was slowly bleeding. His breathing also gradually became heavy. However, this guy was indeed a ruthless character. Although his brows were twisted in pain, his expression was still cold. The scissors in his hand became fiercer and fiercer, and he actually used them as if he didn't care about his life. Hastings's body was covered in black flames, completely suppressing the two of them. Muffled groans could be heard as Shea and Dax were repelled one after another. However, the benefits of cooperation between the two of them were obvious. When one of them was in danger, the other would naturally rush to help his companion. Although Hastings was strong, he didn't have the ability to kill both of them at the same time. After fighting for a while, it was still a draw. Gradually, Shea felt that Hastings's situation had changed. Hastings's breathing also started to become hurried. His forehead started to sweat, and his black flames became unstable. One moment it was vigorous, the next it would suddenly dim, and then it would suddenly become vigorous before fading away again. Hastings's attacks were also sometimes strong and sometimes weak. At first, Shea thought that Hastings was using some kind of exquisite trick, but after fighting for a while, his heart suddenly shook. Hastings's poison had flared up? After all, the poison in the Hieronymus spring water hadn't been completely eradicated. It was just that Hastings's method of draining his blood, as well as the antidote he plundered from Mr. Peach, had eliminated most of the poison in Hastings' body. Moreover, in order to preserve his life, Hastings had sealed most of his strength. This allowed him to barely maintain a stable state. As long as he didn't use the strength of a strong expert, he could still maintain it. However, this wasn't absolute. Once the battle went on for too long, although Hastings didn't display the strength of a strong expert, the strength of a high-level expert would still be somewhat unbearable. As one side decreased and the other increased, the poison in his body couldn't be suppressed anymore. Seeing Hastings's momentum weakening, Shea immediately saw an opportunity and shouted, "He's about to die. Attack!" After saying that, Shea pulled himself together and roared again and again. He waved his fire fork and attacked continuously. Sure enough, Hastings's momentum weakened greatly. After blocking a few attacks, it was obvious that his strength wasn't enough. Shea's fire fork chopped down on his head. He barely blocked it with his tri-edged spear and staggered back. Shea saw an opportunity and laughed loudly. He flew over, but Hastings raised his head and glanced at Shea. After forcing Shea away with his tri-edged spear, he turned and ran. Shea was suddenly stunned. He stood there and watched Hastings's figure quickly run away, leaving behind a trail of dust. Damn, this guy actually knows how to run away. Along the way, he had been chased by Hastings to the point of no escape. His mind had become accustomed to this. How could he have thought that Hastings would also run away? He had been chased all this time and was in a sorry state. Today, he could finally hold his head high. He actually managed to chase away Hastings. This was the first time he had encountered something like this. Although Shea was exhausted, he didn't feel it earlier. Now that Hastings had run away, his hands suddenly went soft and he plopped down on the ground. The fire fork was also thrown to the side. Although his body was exhausted, his mood was very good. He couldn't help but look up to the sky and laugh 3 times. Then, he fell down on the ground, gasping for breath. Adeline finally screamed and ran over. She didn't care about the dust, dirt, blood and other stains on Shea's body. She hugged Shea tightly and helped him up. Shea opened his mouth and stuck out his tongue as he gasped for breath. He forced out a smile and weakly shouted, "Ha ha ha ha! Good. Really damn good. Ha!" Lao Tzu actually chased away Hastings. Adeline just hugged Shea and looked at this face that she couldn't be more familiar with. How many nights had she yearned for his eyes and brows, but at this moment, they were right in front of her, alive and well. Adeline didn't know what to think. She only felt her throat choking and couldn't say a word. She could only stare at Shea. Shea panted for a while before turning his head to look at Adeline. What did he want to say just now? But when he met Adeline's eyes, he felt an indescribable feeling in Adeline's eyes. His whole body quivered, and he opened his mouth before squeezing out a sentence from his throat. How did you get here? How did I end up here?" It would have been better if she didn't ask this question. The moment she did, all the worries in Adeline's stomach were pulled out. During this period of time, their country had encountered a lot of changes. Although it wasn't that the country was destroyed, it wasn't far from it. She had experienced many dangers along the way. First, she fell into the enemy's hands and lived in fear all day long. Then, she was rescued by that bastard Dak. Rather than being rescued, it would be better to say that she was kidnapped by him. She had fled all the way until a few days ago, when only the 2 of them were left. They were in a sorry state in the wilderness, with no one to respond to their cries and no one to help them. They had almost died. After being asked by Shea, Adeline seemed to have finally found someone to rely on. She suddenly burst into tears. It was as if all the grievances, fright, longing, and worries that had accumulated in her heart all these days were all vented out at this moment. She cried and hugged Shea tightly. Her tears and snot were all smeared on Shea's body. If it was any other man, such as Todoro, Shea would have already kicked him. But at this moment, the pitiful creature was throwing himself on his body, crying his heart out. Shea's heart softened for no reason. He only felt that the appearance of this brother hugging him was indescribably sorrowful and pitiful, as if the scene of him hugging him and crying bitterly seemed to be so ***king natural and harmonious. Speaking of which, Shea's feelings towards Adeline had always been rather subtle. Perhaps in the unseen world, people naturally had some sort of special sixth sense or subconscious. In any case, Shea always felt some pity for this poor thing in his heart, but it was also an inexplicable feeling. Even in the few charming dreams that he had in the past, the characters that appeared were all inexplicably turned into this poor thing. After Shea woke up from the dream, he broke out in a cold sweat. After waking up from the dream, he was very distressed for a while. Is there something wrong with Lao Tzu? Could it be that Lao Tzu also turned into a rabbit like Bonfrite or the Crown Prince? Although it was a little creepy when he thought about it, the feeling seemed to be quite good when he thought about it carefully. More importantly, at this moment, the pitiful worm was hugging him, but Shea didn't have the slightest bit of disgust. Instead, he felt that such a scene couldn't be more natural. Deep in his heart, there was even a trace of indescribable enjoyment. The poor thing cried for a while, but Shea's mind was in a mess. He only felt like he was dreaming. Finally, when the poor thing's crying gradually subsided, the country bumpkin forced a smile. "What's wrong with you? Also, why are you here? Look at how dirty you are. You seem to have crawled out of a muddy pond. Damn it, you look like a dirty goblin. Speaking of goblins, he immediately recalled the days when the two of them were adventurous. The poor thing suddenly could not help but smile. This smile made Shaya's eyes widen. It turned out that her face was originally covered in mud, but after crying for a while, the tears had already washed away a lot of the dust on her face. Her originally black face also revealed a few snowy white streaks. Finally, with such a smile, she was originally a peerless beauty. With such a pear blossom in the rain and a smile like the sun after the rain, her beauty was instantly limitless. Shaya could not help but stare blankly at her. This had nothing to do with his aesthetic standards. As long as it was a man, the woman he truly liked, regardless of her appearance, was always the most attractive in his heart. From this point of view, it was obvious that our country bumpkin had unknowingly fallen into a subtle emotion. Staring at the poor thing like this, the poor thing seemed to be stunned for a moment. He could not help but wrinkle his nose and gently push Shaya. What are you looking at? Shaya's brain seemed to be stuffed with paste, and he was in a daze. He faintly felt that something was wrong. He forced himself to rouse himself and forced a smile. It's nothing. Well, why do you look so miserable? You seem to have lost some weight. But you seem to be more energetic than before. As he said this, he almost subconsciously patted the poor thing's shoulder. However, he didn't expect that at this moment the pitiful worm just so happened to straighten his back and sit up straight. Shaya's pat did not hit Adeline's shoulder. Instead, it was a slap. You seem to have lost some weight. How did you train your chest muscles? Shaya's mouth was wide open. No, why are they so soft? Immediately, Shaya's expression suddenly changed. He stared at Adeline with his eyes wide open. Suddenly, he realized that Adeline's clothes were not right. He screamed, "Ah! And why are you wearing women's clothes?" Subconsciously, his hand was pressing on a place that should not be pressed. He could not help but retract his fingers and gently pinched twice. Finally, no matter how stupid the country bumpkin was, he should have understood where this strange feeling came from. Ah! An incomparably mournful scream rang out from the wilderness. A rumbling sound came from afar. The dark clouds above the sky were so thick that it seemed like they were about to pour down. In the rolling clouds, streaks of lightning flashed intermittently. Then came the muffled thunder like the sigh of the gods. There seemed to be no more brilliance between heaven and earth. In the huge palace, the square was shrouded in dark shadows. More and more palace guards had gathered here. In the side door, one by one, the prominent dignitaries of the empire, with a frightened expression, anxiously ran toward the door inside under the lead of the palace attendants. It seemed that the atmosphere was so gloomy that it was suffocating. In the palace, just outside the largest hall, the dignitaries of the empire, dressed in all kinds of luxurious clothes, were already standing in a row. Almost all the prominent people in the imperial capital were gathered here. There were nobles with a long family history, descendants of the founding ministers, dukes, marquises and earls, and ministers of the various deployments of the empire. Everyone stood there and stared anxiously at the closed door of the palace. Everyone's expression was solemn and anxious. Their gazes almost looked as if they wanted to see through the door. However, there were several golden-armored warriors standing at the entrance. Their expressions were grave and stern, and the halberds in their hands were shining with a cold light. No one spoke. Everyone kept their mouths shut. Finally, the sound of footsteps came from the corridor. Someone shouted, "The Prime Minister is here." Suddenly, the quiet crowd burst into an uproar. The Prime Minister of the Empire, Salim Benili, rushed over with small hurried steps. The old Prime Minister's cheeks were thin, and he couldn't hide his deep exhaustion. His eyes were already sunken. Along the way, his footsteps were still a bit unsteady. Seeing the arrival of the old Prime Minister, although he had never been taken seriously before the war, after the war broke out, he had vaguely become the backbone of the imperial capital Australia. After the war broke out, Salimbonese had shown many ways to appease the people, and with the support of Adric and other powerful military figures, he quickly took over the affairs of the imperial capital. This had already established his position. Seeing the arrival of the Prime Minister, the dignitaries of the empire, who were waiting outside the hall, swarmed over as if they had seen a bright light. "Lord Salimbonese! Lord Prime Minister!" Lord Salimbonile's face was gloomy. He kept walking quickly, but his eyes quickly swept over these people. Seeing the forced sadness on these people's faces, the old Prime Minister sneered in his heart. Was it sadness? Or was it fear of what was about to happen? Suppressing the impatience in his heart, he finally stopped in his tracks. As soon as he stopped, the people around him surrounded him in layers. Even the palace attendant who was leading the way was pushed to the side. "Lord, we want to see His Majesty." "Lord Prime Minister, how is His Majesty?" "The rebel army outside the city is attacking urgently. How can His Majesty not come out to take charge at this time?" "Lord! Lord! Lord!" Salimbonese took a deep breath. The words in his heart had been brewing for a long time. Looking at these people, he couldn't help but feel a trace of disdain. He knew the fear in these people's hearts. Just last night the latest news came from the sea. Since the outbreak of the Civil War, the situation in the northern part of the empire had deteriorated. Almost the entire northern part of the empire had fallen when the rebel army issued the proclamation. Odin's people took advantage of the situation and took over 4 prefectures. As for the other military regions, they rebelled within a day. The only place that could barely be considered to be under the control of the central government was the dozen or so prefectures southeast of the imperial capital. These dozen or so prefectures had always been under the control of the central government. After the outbreak of the Civil War, the central government of the empire had issued a mobilization order to gather all the troops stationed in the southeastern part of the empire. They were going to reinforce the imperial capital Australia. The dozen or so prefectures in the southeastern part of the empire had always been garrisoned by the Central Standing Army. The Central Army consisted of the 1st, 4th, 8th, and 10th Divisions. In name, the Central Standing Army of the Byzantine Empire had a total of 13 divisions. The most famous of them was naturally the 13th Corps, known as Rhodria. Over the years, the struggle between the central government and the warlords had been focused on the control of the Central Standing Army. Out of the 13 divisions of the empire, after so many wars, there were no more than 13 divisions that could still be maintained. For example, the 1st and 4th divisions had been heavily damaged in the war with Odin's people more than 10 years ago. Afterwards, due to the empire's financial difficulties, the military was taken over by the warlords. The 1st and 4th divisions lacked military funds and could not be rebuilt. They could only be garrisoned in the southeastern part of the empire. Adding on the fact that the warlords were bribed and roped in, the 3rd and 11th armies had long become the claws and teeth of the warlord. It could be said that the armies that were truly under the control of the central government of the empire, the 6th, 7th, 9th, and 13th divisions in the north, had all fallen into the flames of war. There were still the 1st and 4th divisions in the south that existed in name only, as well as the 8th and 10th divisions that lacked military funds, equipment, and training. After the outbreak of the war, the central government of the empire had already issued a mobilization order for the southern armies to reinforce the imperial capital Australia. The 1st and 4th divisions already existed in name only, and they could barely be used as garrison troops. Naturally, there was no hope for them. As for the 8th and 10th divisions, those that were thought to still have some fighting power were also ordered to move quickly and move closer to the imperial capital at all costs. The two armies, although they had declined, but in the end they still had a bit of arrogance. In the early stages of the war, before the news was cut off, the news from the south was that the 8th and 10th Divisions were the main force, along with some local garrison troops from more than 10 counties, and most of the peasant soldiers were gathered to form an army of nearly 80,000 that was already moving towards the imperial capital. Everyone knew that the imperial capital could not be defended for long. However, if there were still such reinforcements from the south, it seemed that the soldiers and civilians trapped in Osgiliath still had some hope in their hearts. However, just last night, a piece of news came that suddenly made the hands and feet of all the imperial bigwigs in the city turn cold. The 80,000 reinforcements were of varying quality to begin with. They were an army that was put together at the last minute. Just the logistics alone was a mess. They were barely able to force their way to the north after being urged by the imperial capital many times. However, just a few days ago, the Tima military district in the south of the empire, which had been silent since the outbreak of the Civil War, finally raised the flag of rebellion and announced that they had joined the rebel camp of Hughes and Salvador. At the same time, the two rebel armies attacked the reinforcements from the north from both sides. In an ambush on a small river called Salius, the 80,000 troops were completely defeated. 1/3 of them were killed or injured, and the remaining half were scattered. The rest were all captured by the rebel army. The more than 10 counties in the south spent 2 months emptying their warehouses and trying their best to piece together the military supplies and equipment, but they were all taken by the rebel army. The news that came was that the general of the 8th Division had died in battle, and the general of the 10th Division had surrendered after being captured. The 80,000 reinforcements from the south, the last strategic mobile force of the empire, no longer existed. This news spread throughout the upper echelons of the imperial capital that night. Suddenly, many people heard the news, and some rushed to the palace overnight to ask for an audience with Emperor Cantos to deal with the situation. There were also some who secretly found a way to contact the rebel army in order to find a way to retreat in the future. After hearing this news, Emperor Cantos wasn't very angry, and his reaction was very calm. However, there was news that the emperor was sick and bedridden that night. No one really thought that the 80,000 troops from the south would be able to defeat the rebel army. Everyone could see that the fate of the Byzantine Empire had fallen to the bottom. However, the 80,000 troops were always the last hope. As long as there was a trace of hope, there was at least a trace of reason to comfort themselves and deceive themselves. However, when this reason no longer existed, everyone— Salambanili suddenly straightened his back and shouted, "Everyone!" At this moment, the exhaustion on his face magically disappeared, and a sharp light burst out from his old eyes. Everyone who was swept by his gaze couldn't help but step back and shut their mouth. "Everyone, you are all important officials of the Empire. The situation of the Empire today requires everyone to be united and work together to get through this crisis. The Empire has been established for thousands of years, and its roots are deep. What kind of storm has it not faced? 100 years ago, when Odin invaded, he also fought all the way to Osgiliath. Didn't the Empire unite and fight those barbarians back to the north? The situation at that time may not be better than today." The old Prime Minister was full of energy and his voice was like metal. Every word was sonorous. Although the rebel army has swept through the city, there are still more than 20,000 elite soldiers of the Empire. Outside the city, there are also the 2nd and 9th Divisions of the Empire. The ones leading them are also famous generals of the Empire. There is also the soul of the Empire's army, the 13th Corps, outside the city, fighting a bloody battle with the rebel army. There is still a lot to be done for the Empire, so why are you all so panicked? Don't lose your status." He coldly looked at everyone and sneered, "All right. I am going to see His Majesty and report on the military affairs. As for you all, those who should disperse, disperse. Go back and do what you need to do. As long as the deployments did their jobs well, they would be contributing to the Empire. His Majesty is here, I am here, and General Adric is here. With nearly 100,000 soldiers inside and outside the city, this empire will not fall. With that, he swung his sleeves and walked forward. Wherever he went, those who stood in his way would subconsciously lower their heads and make a path for him. The old Prime Minister walked all the way to the entrance of the hall. The golden-armored warriors guarding the door immediately stepped aside and opened the door for him to enter. Soon after, the door closed. The people outside the door all had different expressions. Some were comforted, some were worried, and some were disdainful. But in the end, they all looked at each other for a while and gradually dispersed. After entering the hall and closing the door, the old Prime Minister, Salim Benili, who was holding his head high, suddenly staggered and almost fell to the ground. He barely managed to stand up by holding onto the wall. When he looked up, his face was frighteningly pale. The palace attendant who was leading the way was shocked and couldn't help but tremble. "Prime Minister, shut up!" Salim Benili's eyes were cold as he shouted in a low voice. "Quiet! Do you want the people outside to hear you?" He struggled to stand up, but his steps were weak and there was a trace of blood flowing from the corner of his mouth. His eyes changed, and he slowly swallowed the blood in his mouth. After gently wiping the blood from the corner of his mouth, the old Prime Minister straightened his back and snorted. That sharp gaze clearly carried a chilling will to die. Looking at the dim hall, the old Prime Minister suddenly felt a trace of sorrow in his heart. "The sky looks like it's going to collapse. I don't know if I can lift it up." Suddenly, he thought of the old opponent who had suppressed him for nearly 20 years. Salim Benili gritted his teeth. Cavalier, if you were still alive, would you be able to do better than me?" "I've already done my best. This chapter is 9,000 words, I haven't written such a long chapter in a long time. I'm trying to mend my character. To be continued. If you want to know the future, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 361. GOR Chapter 342 Seeking Life Amidst Death 1. There was a peculiar expression on Shaya's face. There was a 30% sneer, 30% awkwardness, 30% wretchedness, and the remaining 10% appeared to be a sigh of relief. On the country bumpkin's face, there was a 5-finger imprint. The imprint looked slender and long, and the black imprint was imprinted on his face. However, he could only cover his face timidly, not daring to look at the pitiful creature. Adeline's instinctive reaction to the attack on her chest was to slap him. However, after doing so, she regretted it. Seeing the country bumpkin holding his face and avoiding her gaze, Adeline retracted her hand and her face turned red. I did not mean to hit you." After saying that, her voice became almost inaudible. Shaya's eyes darted back and forth. In the end, he let out a strange laugh and muttered something to himself. If one were to get closer, they would be able to hear what this country bumpkin was muttering to himself. "I am not sick. It turns out Lao Tzu is not sick. Ha 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 ha, Lao Tzu is not a rabbit." The two enemies were already standing there, feeling a little awkward between each other. They didn't know whether to speak or not to speak. It was then that a sigh could be heard from the side. "Hey! Just now I also helped out in the fight. I also bled so much. You long-legged girl, you are too heartless. You only went to help him and not me." Dax had a treacherous smile on his face as he sat on the ground. The large pair of scissors had been tossed aside, and he had one hand on his chest. It was as though he did not care that the wound on his chest had burst open and blood was flowing out freely. If this were in the past, Adeline would not have cared if he died. At present, however, continuing to sit beside Shaya was too awkward. Hearing Dax's words, Adeline quickly jumped up and ran to Dax's side to help him up. Then, she hastily pulled out some medicine. Dax looked at Adeline, whose face was flushed red, and then looked at Shea, who was still holding his face in a daze in the distance, and said in a low voice, "This lover of yours seems to be a fool? Bah! You're the stupid one." Adeline's face darkened. Dax's eyes were filled with malice. He glanced at Adeline's chest and said, "Slap him for every touch. Sigh, it's worth it." Seeing how eager this bastard was, Adeline grabbed the large pair of scissors on the ground and snapped it twice. She looked at Dax coldly and said, "If you dare to touch me, I'll cut off your—" At this time, Adeline suddenly felt someone poking her from behind. She turned around and saw Shea standing behind her, looking at her with a painful expression. His finger poked her shoulder. "Hey." Shea's voice was very solemn. Adeline blushed and looked at him tenderly. Are you really a woman? You! How can you be a woman?" Sparks began to appear in her eyes. How can there be a woman who looks like you?" Veins popped out on her forehead. Were you a woman from the beginning? Or did you suddenly become like this?" Shea carefully asked. Adeline finally exploded. She jumped up and gave him a kick. "Go to hell. You bastard country bumpkin!" Shea looked at the kick flying towards him. If it was in the past, how could this poor thing kick him? This brat's fancy punches and kicks. He could send him flying with a casual slap. But now that she had kicked him, Shea was about to fight back when he suddenly remembered that she was a woman. How could he have the nerve to punch out with his clenched fist? Bang! The kick landed squarely on Shea's nose. Seeing that there was another shoe mark on Shea's face in addition to the 5-finger mark, Adeline felt some regret. She had a stomach full of anger, but she didn't know how to express it. This country bumpkin's words were too infuriating. Moreover, she and he had even done such shameful things. How could he say that about her? Could it be that he dared to deny it? At this thought, Adeline suddenly felt wronged. But she didn't realize that on that muddle-headed night in the imperial capital, Uncle Shea didn't even know what sin he had committed that night. Now, between the two of them, one was guilty and the other was wronged. But they held it in and didn't say anything. Shea exchanged a few words with Dax. When he heard the poor thing cry for help, he thought this guy didn't look like a good person. Actually, Shea was also a little unhappy with Dax. This guy always had a strange smile on his face that deserved a beating. This expression was somewhat similar to that of Darwin, who had made him suffer a lot. However, he had helped him to chase away Hastings just now. He could be considered a comrade who had sweated and bled together. After politely greeting him, Shea saw Daphne. Daphne was sick. She was in a coma for a while, and had yet to regain consciousness. She was just lying on the ground, motionless. Although she was sick, this #1 beauty among the nobles of the empire didn't hide her beauty at all. Instead, her sickly appearance made her look even more delicate and sad. It didn't reduce her beauty at all, but made people feel a little pity for her. Shea had just walked over when he immediately recognized the identity of this sickly beauty. It seemed like another woman who had been attacked by his chest? Yes. It was during the hunting meet outside the imperial capital. By the river, he had saved her life and blocked an assassination attempt for her. At that time, Shea had already known Daphne's identity. She was the crown princess. However, this country bumpkin knew that the water was too deep for him to touch. Therefore, he had pretended to be ignorant in front of the old emperor. But now, this beautiful crown princess was lying in front of him, looking like she had lost her soul. He turned to look at Adeline. Adeline couldn't care less about being angry with Shea. She walked over and hugged Daphne, her face full of worry. "Elder sister is sick. Sigh. On this journey, if she hadn't accompanied and taken care of me, I'm afraid I would have already." Shea, you must save her. Elder sister. Shea's eyes inadvertently flashed with a trace of light. Her Highness the Crown Princess is your elder sister? Then you. Adeline's face turned red. Before she could say anything, Dax had already walked over slowly. He smiled and said, "The identity of the long-legged girl, he. To be able to call the future Empress sister of the Empire, she is naturally not an ordinary person. She is the daughter of the Byzantine Empire's royal family, Princess Adeline. Her Royal Highness, Crown Princess." Shea wasn't an idiot. He immediately recalled the time when the two of them were together. The past was still vivid in his mind. The elite knight who chased after her, the cavalry who took her away. Damn, the royal family's matters are really strange. The Crown Princess is being assassinated, and the princess is also being assassinated. Shea pondered for a while. How did you come here? The imperial capital. Is the imperial capital still there? Adeline shook her head. We were captured by the rebel army a few days ago. It was this Mr. Dax who brought us out. The imperial capital. We don't know what happened to the imperial capital. The imperial capital is still there. Dax answered Shea's question. This guy's eyes flashed as he looked at the country bumpkin. Right now, General Adric is in charge of the situation in Osgilla. The Lantis Kingdom has already sent a fleet to assist Osgilla. Outside the city, General Rohr is leading the Rodreer cavalry, as well as the 2nd and 7th Corps. The situation hasn't gotten too bad for now. I think, even if the rebel army is strong, it shouldn't be a problem for them to hold on for a few months. Shea nodded and looked at Dax. What about you? May I ask, what is your identity? Dax smiled. Me? My name is Popov Dax. You can think of me as a mercenary. Haha, I do things for money. I'm willing to do things like murder and arson. This was clearly an excuse. However, since Dax didn't want to talk about it, Shea didn't deliberately pursue the matter. After nodding, Shea felt the poor thing's gaze on him. He felt his scalp tingle and quickly turned to look at Daphne on the ground. Sigh, this crown princess is quite pitiful. Adeline sighed faintly. Isn't that so? Sister was kind enough to send me out of the city. In the end, she was captured by the rebel army and suffered so much along the way. I'm not talking about that. Shea scratched his head. That, she is the crown princess, right? Sigh. Marrying a rabbit, isn't that pitiful enough? Poor thing. Dax looked at Shea, then looked at Adeline. Suddenly, he smiled. Your Excellency Shea Thunder, right? Can I have a chat with you? Oh. Shea glanced at the man. There was always something wrong with this guy's body. I have heard of your Excellency's name before. You should be the one who made a name for yourself during the war with Odin and the war god Hastings. You were praised by the Empire, right? Dax smiled and said unhurriedly, I have also heard of your Excellency's bravery. For your Excellency to receive such recognition at such a young age, your future will naturally be smooth sailing. Later on, I heard that your Excellency was appointed as a general and unified the military affairs of the county. To receive such a heavy responsibility at such a young age. All right. Shea waved his hand and looked at Dax. I don't like to beat around the bush. I am the Shea Thunder you were talking about. You don't have to report my resume. You just have to tell me what you want to say to me. Dax took a deep breath and said with a serious tone, How is the situation in the north? Shea looked at this guy. Silton County belongs to Manninger, but Moore County is still in the hands of Lao Tzu. Dax nodded and his eyes lit up. There was a strange look in his eyes. Moore County is still in your hands? Shea shook his head. What's so strange about that? Lao Tzu refused to surrender, so he could only fight with Odin. Dax pursed his lips into a strange smile. He bowed to Shea. That, Your Excellency, I have an idea. I want to make a deal with you. Would you be interested? Shea narrowed his eyes. A deal? What kind of deal? What can you trade with me? A lot. Dax's tone was casual, but the words he said were shocking. Byzantium's northern border has thousands of miles of fertile land, millions of people, dozens of big and small towns, and countless riches. And Odin's scarlet snow armies, tens of thousands of soldiers. All of these can be part of our deal. Salem Bonili stood outside the door. He tidied up his clothes and combed his hair. A palace servant stood beside him with a round mirror. The old prime minister looked at himself in the mirror. His clothes were neat and tidy, and his hair was neat. Only then did he nod. The last door in the hall was slowly pushed open. The old prime minister took a deep breath and strode in. The moment he entered the room, he was greeted by a strong smell of medicine. It was as if even the air was somewhat bitter. The air in the large room was so pungent that the old man frowned slightly. This was Emperor Kantos's bedroom. In the middle of the room there was a large bed. The old emperor was sitting on the edge of the bed, his sparse white hair draped over his shoulders. His thin body was covered in a snow-white robe, but it gave him an eerie feeling. The large and bright candlesticks around did not bring much light to the room. Instead, they made it seem gloomy. Emperor Kantos had just finished his medicine for the day. His breathing was still a little rapid. Hearing footsteps, the old emperor turned around and looked at Salem Bonili. "You're here." Salem Bonili bowed. The old emperor's face darkened. He raised his hand and said, "All of you leave." The surrounding servants in linen robes bowed and retreated. Only the middle-aged man, who was as silent as a shadow, remained standing in the corner of the room. "Outside. How is it?" The old emperor's face seemed to twitch. "It's okay." Salem Bonili hesitated for a moment. "I've already comforted everyone and asked them to leave. I think, all right, you don't have to comfort me." The old emperor suddenly raised his head and smiled. Although his smile was weak, it still carried the valiance of the past. "This is my empire. My subjects. Humph. Of course I know them." The old emperor's pale cheeks turned red. "Humph, if it was before yesterday, the south was still in our hands. In name, there were still 4 central standing armies and more than a dozen garrison troops. Although everyone knows what is going on with these forces. But as long as one day was there, it was still a consolation, a hope. With this hope, everyone can continue to lie to themselves and comfort themselves. They force themselves to stand by my side. Because they know that they are all nobles. And the rebels outside the city are warlords. They are aristocratic warlords. Once the sky falls, the country will change. The nobles in the city will have a hard time keeping their identities. The rebels will not continue to maintain their positions. They will only overthrow them and replace them. That is why these nobles are firmly standing by my side and pledging their loyalty to me. It is not because they are loyal. It is just a choice. As long as I have a glimmer of hope, they will choose to support me. But once I fall, there is no hope left. Then, these fellows' loyalty will cease to exist. At this point in time, the multiple-choice question they were facing had already changed. Either they follow me and the day the city falls, their families will be destroyed and everything will be turned to ashes. Or betray me and join the rebels. Although they will not be able to keep their positions in the future, they will at least be able to keep their lives. At worst, they will hand over all their power and status and go back to being a powerless landlord, struggling to survive. However, given the current situation, to be able to choose the second option is already a good choice. The old emperor's words were sharp. When Salem Bonili heard it, the corners of his eyes twitched. He was about to say something when the old emperor sneered. "You see, Salem Bonili, after tonight, these fellows will go back and do their own thing. Some will write letters to the rebels outside the city, some will prepare an escape route, and some—" The old prime minister looked up with a gloomy face. "Lord Adric has already sent troops to guard the city." Even if these fellows want to do something, they will not be able to do anything. The old emperor fell silent. He sat on the edge of the bed, still facing Salem Bonili. After a long silence he asked, "Are the soldiers in the south really gone?" "Gone," the old prime minister said through gritted teeth. "Your Majesty, this is the last of the troops we can deploy. In fact, from the beginning, I strongly opposed the transfer of the 4 southern armies. The 4 southern armies have been idle for too long. The training and equipment of those tens of thousands of soldiers are not enough. If we leave them there and station them there to protect ourselves, we can still barely keep the southern counties under our control. Even if something happens and Austria can't be protected, we can still give up on the capital and retreat to the south. We can use the dozens of prefectures in the south as our base to deal with the rebels. But now the forceful transfer of 80,000 soldiers would instantly drain all the power in the south. With 80,000 soldiers gone, the 10 or so commanderies in the south might not even have the ability to protect themselves. Once the rebel army splits up and bypasses Austria to the south, they won't. The old emperor suddenly showed some of the decisiveness of the Qigong emperor. He clenched his fists, his eyes sharp, and said without hesitation, "The rebels will not split their forces to go south, because this will only cause internal strife." The old emperor's breathing continued. Every time he breathed, his lungs would produce a heavy noise like a broken bellows. But Emperor Kantos's tone was so resolute. "I wish everyone a happy weekend, haha. I went to Shanghai last week. This Friday I will spend some time with my girlfriend. But don't worry, there will be updates every day. It won't stop after that. Please vote, recommendation votes, monthly votes, whatever you like. To be continued. If you want to know the future, please go to www.chidian.com. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 362. GOR Chapter 342 Seeking Life Amid Death Part 2 They will not split up their forces to attack the south. Salvatore is not an idiot. Hughes is even less of an idiot. Now that we are here in Ostjilla, the rebel army can still unite to deal with us. But once they split up their forces to attack the south, the rebel army will split up. When that happens, everyone knows that going south to fight for territory is the easiest and most beneficial thing to do. Staying behind to chew on the hard bone that is Ostjilla is the most difficult and unrewarding thing to do. If that happens, the governors of the rebel army are not fools. Who would not want to fight for the juicy meat? Who would not want to leave the hard bone for others to chew on? Once such a dispute arises, they will no longer be able to unite, so Salvatore and Hughes will definitely stop this from happening. Hughes and Salvatore are the 2 strongest rebel forces. As long as the 2 of them suppress them, the rebel army will not split up their forces to attack the south. Even though Emperor Kantos was so old and weak, his thoughts were still clear and resolute when he spoke of these matters. However, despite his resolute tone, his aura was gradually weakening. Salambanili sighed inwardly and said, "Your Majesty, but we, Salambanili, let me tell you, we will win. We will win this war. We will defeat those bastards, do you believe me?" The old emperor's eyes suddenly lit up and he stared at Salambanili with a burning gaze. "Those bastards will not last long. Their unity will not last long in the face of great benefits. And the stupidest thing they did was to lure Odin's men in. Now that the situation in the north has deteriorated, Odin's men have already stepped into our territory. Your Majesty, this is what I am most worried about." The old prime minister lowered his head and said, "If it were just the rebel army, we might be able to hold on. However, Odin's 100,000 men have already entered the north and the 4 northern prefectures have fallen. But are we the ones who need to worry?" The old emperor suddenly revealed a sinister smile. "Salambanili, have you forgotten? We only have 4 northern prefectures. However, there were close to 20 military districts that belonged to the rebel army. Now that Odin, this majestic tiger and wolf, had come in, those 4 counties would be taken over by them. But what happened next? Odin, this tiger and wolf, was greedy by nature. They would never be full just because they had occupied 4 counties. Once time passed, with 100,000 soldiers outside, how could these Odin people not eat the juicy meat right under their noses? Stupid! Salambanili's forehead was dripping with cold sweat. He raised his head and stared at the Emperor as he cried out, "Your Majesty! You've been planning to. The North has long been ours." The old Emperor narrowed his eyes. "This is not something that has just happened. The North has been ours for decades. The 4 counties at the border don't mean much to us. Instead, we will have to send a few of our central standing armies to defend them." Who exactly did the North belong to? It's the rebel army. Corsica, Armenia, and those bastards from El Salvador. This situation has existed for decades. Unfortunately, we have never been able to understand the logic behind it. Since the North is no longer ours, why don't we throw it out? Let the Odin people come in and fight with the rebel army. The old Emperor clenched his fists and his knuckles cracked. The Odin people will never come to Osgilla. The rebel army will never agree to let the Odin army meet up with them in Osgilla. If the Odin army wants to come to Osgilla, they will have to march 3,000 li from the north. But don't forget, the 3,000 li along the way is the territory of the Tima military district. It's not ours. Those bastards, how could they let the 100,000 Odin army march into their territory? At this moment, Emperor Kantos seemed to be rejuvenated. He waved his fists and shouted resolutely, "Time? As long as we can win time. All we have to do is defend Osgria to the death. Half a year, no. 3 months. It won't even take that long for the North to descend into chaos. Those tigers and wolves of the Odin army will not be satisfied with the territory in their hands. They will definitely want to take more. The rebel army will not always be united. As long as the Odin people become restless, some of them will rush back to protect their own territory. Once the rebel army splits up, it will never be able to reunite. The North will fall into the flames of war and chaos. When that time comes, the biggest enemy the rebel army will face will not be us, but the Odin people. Let them fight as they please. Fight for 1 year, 3 years. Let them be. The rotten meat of the North has been growing on the Empire for decades. We should have cut it off and given it up long ago. Unfortunately, I have never understood the logic behind it. No, or rather, I have understood it, but I have been unable to make up my mind. After all, that is 3,000 li of land. But now we have no other choice. Salambanili, defend. Defending Osgilla will give us the opportunity to win. Once the North falls into chaos and the rebel army splits up, the army outside the city will naturally fall apart. The Empire's warlords are worried about the North. The warlords in the South are weak. As long as the Odin army enters the North to pin down the rebel army, we will be able to take care of the situation in the South. When that time comes in 2 years, our army will be enough to clean up the mess in the South. As long as the South is pacified, we will still have half of the Empire. Half of the Empire? Salambanili's eyes lit up as well. He was shocked by the crazy plan that the old Emperor had proposed. But thinking about it carefully, such a plan seemed to be the only way to survive in the midst of death. Half of the Empire. Half of the Empire. Give up all the territories in the north of the Empire. Those territories no longer belonged to the Empire's central government anyways. They had been divided into pieces by the Tima military district. Since they no longer belonged to them, they might as well give them up. Leave it to the Odin people and the rebel army to fight amongst themselves. It would be best if they could get their brains splattered out. As for the empire, they would concentrate their forces in the south and unify the south. The south had always been the weakest area in the Tema military district. After all, historically, the Tema military district was set up to prevent the Odin people from invading. The south was behind the empire, so the Tema military district was rarely set up. The warlords were not strong either. As long as His Majesty's plan succeeded, they would temporarily give up the territories in the north to fight for. The empire only needed to concentrate their forces and pacify the south. They would still have half of the empire, although it seemed like only half of the empire was left. This half of the empire would completely belong to the empire's central government. Orders from top to bottom would be obeyed. One was a huge but fragmented empire that refused to submit to the central government's rule. The other was an absolute cut-off half of the empire's territory, but it would listen to the central government's orders 100%. Although it seemed like it had lost a lot of territory, in terms of strength, it was much stronger. If they could really hold half of the empire in their hands, they would work hard in the future, integrate their forces, reorganize their military, and lead an expedition to the north. They would have a chance to conquer the northern territories. Seeking life in death. Seeking life in death. Thinking of this, Salambanili's heart suddenly trembled. He looked at Emperor Cantos and said, "Your Majesty, this plan it was drawn up by Cavashir when he was alive." When Emperor Cantos mentioned Cavashir's name, his body seemed to sway. He said in a low voice, "From the declaration of war until now, every step I took was according to his plan. I know this plan is too dangerous, but Cavashir told me, if I don't do this, the empire will die. If I do this, there is still a 50% chance of survival." As expected, it was Cavashir. Salambanili couldn't help but sigh. Thinking of this guy who was his biggest enemy, he didn't know why, but he suddenly felt a chill in his heart. So this was the whole plan. Salambanili. Emperor Cantos gradually calmed down. His back, which was straightened when he was agitated just now, bent down again. He sat there as if the last bit of energy in his body had been sucked out after the generosity just now. This muffled call made Salambanili feel a bit uneasy. "I have to say sorry to you, Your Majesty." The old Prime Minister quickly lowered his head. "No, you don't have to say anything." Emperor Cantos smiled bitterly. "I know that you have been a bit depressed as the Prime Minister. When Cavashir was here, I gave most of the power to him. You have always been in an awkward position as the Prime Minister. Since the beginning of the war, I have seen everything you have done in the imperial capital. Your efforts, your persistence, your loyalty." He raised his finger, and the quiet middle-aged man in the corner walked out and gently placed a scroll in front of the old Prime Minister. "Open it and take a look." Emperor Cantos smiled, but there was an inexplicable meaning in his smile. Salambanili used his trembling hand to open the scroll. After a few glances, his face changed. His hand trembled and the scroll fell to the ground. He looked up with a pale face. "Your Majesty." On the scroll, there was a list of people who were going to be rewarded. There were a total of 11 names in the entire Salambanili family, and they were all capable men of the Salamis family. The youngest was only 15 years old, and the oldest was him, Salambanili. They were all given high nobles and high officials. In one breath, he had given the Salamu family 8 noble titles. 2 of them were earls, 3 were viscounts, and 3 were barons. At the same time, it was written very clearly that a rich county in the south would become the Salamu family's territory. Since the founding of the empire 1,000 years ago, only a few of the founding fathers of the empire had such an illustrious title and such a vast territory. But now, 1,000 years later, where else could a family get such great power? Once this reward was implemented, it would not be an exaggeration to say that the Salamu family would immediately become the #1 family in the empire. Thinking about it, this kind of momentum could only be compared to the Tulip family in the past. How could Salambanili not be shocked by such a generous reward? His hands were trembling so much that he could not hold the scroll. He could only open his mouth and stare at Emperor Cantos. Emperor Cantos whispered, I have already sent someone out of the city tonight, with a personally written edict to the Rodria cavalry's encampment. The old emperor smiled gently. I have personally written the edict to pass the throne to Garcia. I hope you will properly assist him in the future, He pointed at the reward in front of Salambanili and smiled faintly. I did not give this to Adrik or Roer. Salambanili, you have to understand my intentions. Do you understand? Salambanili trembled and stared at the old emperor with wide eyes. After taking a few deep breaths, he said, I understand. Balance. This is balance. On one hand, the old emperor wanted to make up for the guilt he felt towards Salambanili and reward him for his loyalty to the empire. On the other hand, there was another more important reason: balance. This time, if the Empire survives this crisis, if the plan left behind by Cavashir really succeeds, then the Empire will have half of the Empire's territory. The Empire will have control over half of the country and will work hard for the future. But then, there is still a problem. The military power in the hands of these generals is too heavy. Although Adrik is an important general trusted by His Majesty, he is now the Minister of Military Affairs and has a high prestige. Once this war is won, then it can even be said that Adrik's prestige in the military can even be compared to the old Duke of Minas. Moreover, the generals of the 2nd and 9th Corps are all old subordinates of Adrik, and Roer's 13th Corps was trained by Adrik for 9 years. After the war, these generals of the Empire will have military power in their hands. At that time, who can guarantee that they will not become the second warlord party? Even if there is no doubt about the loyalty of Adrik and the others, but as a king, he will never tolerate his subordinates to be dominant. In order to balance the military power in the future, then he, Salambanili, will be the candidate that the royal family will promote to compete with the military. The rebels will not divide their forces and go south. If Osgilla defends, then the war will be won. If Osgilla doesn't defend, then it will be a total defeat. Dax looked at Shea with a smile. Osgilla is the eye of this storm. In my opinion, although the rebels seem strong, in fact, they have already fallen into a dilemma. Hundreds of thousands of rebels are just ants in a sandcastle. Breaking it is not difficult. Looking for recommendation votes. To be continued. If you want to know the future, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 363. Today's first update. There will be more later. GOR Chapter 343. Begging. As Dax was saying those words, he was seated before Shea. This fellow had not washed his face for who knows how many days. His face was stained with dirt and his eyes were black. There were even 2 piles of excrement at the corners of his eyes. His clothes were torn and dirty and his chest area was tightly wrapped. There were even traces of blood seeping out from his clothes. This fellow did not appear to be much better off than a refugee. Truth be told, if this was in the past, there would be someone like this who would brag in front of him. He looked as though he had been starving for 7 to 8 days. To think that he would say something like, an army of hundreds of thousands is nothing more than ants entering a sand castle. Breaking it will not be difficult. He stared at those excrement-filled eyes and said those words as though he was looking down on the world. Shea simply wanted to kick him. However, this fellow had just helped him beat off Hastings. To suddenly turn against him like this, it did not seem like something Shea would do. Looking at Shea's expressionless face, Dax became dissatisfied. You don't believe me? Shea glanced at him with an expressionless face. What do you think? Truth be told, this was easy to understand. If you were in his shoes and someone who did not even have a few copper coins on him stood before you and said, "The way I see it, Emperor Odin is nothing more than a trophy. The way I see it, the hundreds of thousands of rebel soldiers are nothing more than chickens and dogs." If you were in his shoes, you would also think that the other party's head had been crushed by a car. Fine, it seems you don't believe me. Dax didn't get angry and instead chuckled. However, Sir Xiao Leiming, you have half of Moor County's territory and you also have an army under your command. Could it be that you only want to defend this place to the death and not do anything? Shea glanced at this braggart and spat out. Then, he narrowed his eyes. What do you think? The present situation was clear and Shea himself did not have a clear way out. All this time, he had been painstakingly scheming. All he could do was to maintain the status quo. In the end, all he could do was to maintain. The imperial capital, what a joke! Everyone knew that the imperial capital was the key to this war. However, this crucial point was meaningless to a country bumpkin. The imperial capital had to be defended. Even if the empire continued to exist, it was obvious that the empire would not be able to recover the territories in the north. Without 8 to 10 years of cultivation, the empire would not be able to gather an army that could conquer the north. When that time came, Odin's army would be everywhere in the north, and the rebel army would be as numerous as dogs. Shea only had half a county's worth of land under his control, and Denzel was the only one at the city gates. His army was less than 20,000 strong, and it would be a problem for him to even survive. In the end, the most likely outcome was that they would not be able to hold on. The hundreds of thousands of rebel soldiers, the hundreds of thousands of Odin's soldiers, could drown them with just a mouthful of spit. At worst, he would bring his subordinates and flee to the wildfire plains, burrowing into the goblins' red wilderness and becoming a mountain king. Lao Tzu might even be able to form a relationship with the Jack tribe. Amazing! 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 He pinched his nose and went to hug Godmother Merlin's thigh. With Merlin protecting him, even if the god Emperor Odin wanted to cause trouble for him, he would have to think twice before doing so, right? Risking his life to instigate a fight between Manninger and the Corsica military was just to buy him some time. As a result, what else could he do? To tell the truth, Shea did not have much ambition in his heart at the moment. His previous struggle was only because he had the will to never surrender to Odin's people. As for what would happen in the future, he did not have a clear idea. Looking at Shea's disdainful expression, Dax heaved a sigh of relief instead. However, there was a hint of satisfaction in this guy's eyes. Very good, very good. Such a guy, although not enlightened yet, was this not what he had been striving for? If Shea was a person full of wisdom, who embraced the world, and who was full of ambition, what could he use to fool this guy? He was not enlightened, and that was good. He was like a piece of white paper, free for him to draw on. Dax raised a finger, his eyes shining brightly as he said in a low voice, "I don't care if you believe me or not, I only have one thing to say to you. If you are willing to do as I say, I guarantee that you will be able to kill your way out of this mess. A Moor County is not enough for a guy like you. Whether you want to become a bandit or live a life of riches and honor, you can choose for yourself." Seeing that Shea was still unmoved, Dax made up his mind and smiled. He reached into his bosom and took out a short golden arrow. He placed it in front of Shea. "I know that words alone cannot move you. However, with this item in hand, I only need to write a letter and I can mobilize tens of millions of gold coins in the northern part of Byzantium's 26 military regions and 19 counties. Even if you use money and gold coins to bribe them, you can still buy a path for yourself. Lantis has been operating his connections in Byzantium for decades. How many officials are there? Even in the governor's palace of the rebel army, there are also people from our side. all the other side's plans, military strategies, as long as I want to know, it cannot escape my eyes and ears. As long as I stand by your side, even if there are flames everywhere. In the darkness, others are deaf and blind, but your eyes and ears are clear. No one can see more clearly and hear more clearly than you. Everything will be as clear as the lines on your palm. Even if it is the rebel army or Odin's people, if someone comes to attack you, I will know all the habits and preferences of the enemy's general, the advantages and disadvantages of the military strategy, even the number of times he sleeps at night, the position he likes to sleep in. All this information, as long as you need it, I can send it to your desk. Moreover, as long as you have money, you can use money to pave the way. Can't you buy a way out? Those Odin's people might be a bit more difficult, but those rebel armies' military regions, are they a monolith? Shea was stunned. This time, he was truly moved. Raising his head, he stared at the man in front of him. You are Lantis people? Dax's eyes were as firm as iron, but he gently shook his head. I am a man without a country. Seeing the doubt in Shea's eyes, Dax smiled. You only need to believe in me, trust me, and I am willing to use my wealth to join your side and then cause a big ruckus with you. In the northern part of the Empire, there will be a big storm. Your Excellency Shea Thunder, what you need to do is to endure and survive. My judgment is that in 3 to 5 months, at least 1 to 2 months, the Byzantine Empire north of Osgilla will undergo a big change. At that time, looking at Dax's bright eyes, Shea gave him a sideways glance. What you said really makes people jealous. You are paying for it, and you are also an advisor to Lao Tzu. What are you after? Dax laughed dryly, his eyes slanted, but fell on Adeline, who was standing not far away, and said shamelessly in a low voice, I want her. This time, Shea did not hesitate any more. He lifted his leg and viciously kicked Dax's handsome face. Dax's beautiful face suddenly twisted into a ball, and with 2 streaks of blood from his nose, he fell backward. The air in the hall seemed to have solidified. Although the muffled thunder outside came in bursts, it made the air in the room seem even more oppressive. Salambanili only felt that the reward order in his hand was extremely heavy. He felt that his fingers were about to spasm, but he gritted his teeth and finally did not let the paper in his hand fall to the ground. In his mind, in the rumbling thunder, there was only one word like lightning that stabbed straight into the old Prime Minister's heart. Powerful Minister! Powerful Minister! Powerful Minister! The Emperor is openly ordering his ministers to be in power. In the whole family, as long as there was a bit of weight, they were all picked out and conferred high positions. Then, he slowly turned around and left. The Emperor's eyebrows twitched, and he softly said another sentence. This thing. I have already sent someone to deliver it outside the city for Garcia to look at. When the old Prime Minister heard this, he paused for a moment, but he didn't turn around. He only paused for a moment, and then he quickened his pace and strode out of the door. It wasn't until the back of the Prime Minister disappeared that Emperor Cantos's body swayed. He forced himself to hold on to the bed and stand up straight. The old Emperor's voice sounded like he was talking to himself, but it also sounded like he was blaming himself. Salambanili is a smart man. He knows very well that by accepting this order, his entire family will walk on a path of no return. I've let him down. I've also let down many people. The middle-aged man's figure took a step forward from the corner. Your Majesty. Open the window. The Emperor shook his head. The middle-aged man hesitated for a moment. Your Majesty, it's very cold outside your body. Open the window. Emperor Cantos suddenly raised his head, his eyes burning with fire. Open it! After the window was opened, a gust of cold wind whistled in. The Emperor was hit by the wind, and he immediately felt a bone-chilling cold. He raised his head proudly, gritted his teeth, and walked to the window. His hands tightly pressed against the windowsill, and his teeth bit down on his lip. His eyes were wide open as he stared at the ink-black sky. A rumbling sound came from outside the window. The sound was like muffled thunder, causing the old emperor's eyebrows to twitch. He shouted in a low voice, "What is that sound?" "Your Majesty, it's thunder. It's war drums. It's war drums." The old emperor suddenly laughed wildly. "Did you hear that? Those are the war drums of the rebel army outside the city? Ha ha ha. Cavalier, if you're still alive and see your plan coming true, will you be laughing with me? Will you?" After laughing for a while, Wu Ran raised his head and stared at the dark clouds in the sky. He raised both his hands and roared, "Heavens! My Byzantium will not perish." This hoarse roar seemed to be able to pierce through the raging winds, piercing through the clouds. Before he could finish his sentence, the tall and skinny figure suddenly fell backwards. There will be one more update later today. I will continue to repair my character, to be continued. If you want to know what will happen, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 364. GOR Chapter 344. Families glory. Within the city of Osgilla, in the western part of the city, there was a building that was not too eye-catching. However, under the cover of the dark clouds, it appeared to have been dyed with a layer of gray. There were no longer any pedestrians on the street. Occasionally, there would be a group of soldiers walking past in a hurry. The doors of the large mansion were tightly shut. However, there was only one side door that was open. An old servant sat on a chair by the door. He lazily looked at the sky and gently sighed. "Come and go, go and come again. This war has been going on for decades, yet there is still no peace." The city's nobles and commoners were anxious about their future. However, this old servant in a linen robe had a leisurely and indifferent expression on his face. It was as though he did not feel the slightest bit of fear. Instead, there was a sense of transcendence. At this time, when the streets were empty, several luxurious carriages came to a stop outside the mansion. Several people wearing luxurious clothes stood outside the door with anxious expressions on their faces as they waited for something. These fellows could see through their clothes. They were likely people who stood above the clouds. If someone who knew them were to see these fellows, they would likely cry out in alarm. These fellows' titles and official positions were like a condensed version of the empire's central government. However, at this moment, they were obediently standing outside the door. Looking at the old servant's aloof and arrogant demeanor, they dared not make a move and could only wait anxiously. "If you want to wait, then wait. Our old duke will not see anyone." The old servant sighed and continued to curl up on the chair. He squinted his eyes and enjoyed the cool breeze. The wind blew the messy hair on his head, revealing a shocking scar on his forehead. Inside a large mansion within the mansion, a mighty old man with a head full of silver hair stood there with a cold expression on his face. He held a whip in his hand and let out a heavy snort from his nostrils. The whip in his hand was already stained with blood, and several pieces of torn clothes were caught on it. But, after the whip was thrown to the ground, the old man seemed to have finally calmed down. He looked up at the person in front of him. "Do you understand now?" The young man in front of him had a handsome face, but he just happened to have a pair of flying eyebrows, which made him look more heroic and domineering than just being handsome. His body was wrapped in a few cow tendon ropes, binding him tightly. His clothes had been whipped until they were tattered in many places. Blood could be seen in several places. His skin was lacerated and his flesh was lacerated. However, his eyes were still filled with unwillingness and unyieldingness as he stared at the old man. "Father, no matter what you say, I don't understand." He paused for a moment before his next sentence became even more ruthless. A loyal subject can be seen when the country is in danger. Everything I say and do is to make myself worthy of the Mina's family name. The Duke of Mina's body swayed as he looked at his son's stubborn eyes. At that moment, those eyes seemed to have pierced into the old man's heart. The old Duke finally breathed a sigh of relief. He slowly walked to the side and sat down on the armrest of the chair. He looked at his son's unyielding eyes and suddenly smiled bitterly. Stupid! It took a long time for the Duke of Minas to spit out that short word. Rodi looked at his Lao Tzu. He looked at his father, who had been respected in the army for decades. He looked at the Duke of the Empire, who even the arrogant warlords had to be courteous to. Rodi's father's old age, his father's cowardice, his father's concealment of his strength and his accumulated dissatisfaction over the years suddenly erupted under the stimulation of the whip and the blood. Father, I am not stupid. Rodi straightened his back and stared at the Duke of Minas. He then shouted, You can no longer understand what I am thinking. You have also never understood what I am asking for. The old Duke narrowed his eyes. It was unknown how many thoughts were hidden in his eyes. After hearing Rodi's words, he slowly shook his head. Stupid and self-righteous. The old man's Adam's apple move. He raised his eyes and looked at his son in front of him. His voice became soft as if he was talking to himself. You think that I am old. You think that I have lost my courage. You think that you can carry the glory of the Minas family on your tender shoulders. You have opposed me in every way. A few years ago, you abandoned all restraint and sullied yourself to express your dissatisfaction with me. However, I still tolerated you. You wanted to start a career. I also helped you with it. Good. If you want to build a career, I will send you to the north. As for that boy called Shea Thunder, I will send you to him. Sigh. The only thing I did wrong was not urging you to hurry on your journey. I had already expected this big change. I had also guessed that the imperial capital would become a whirlpool. That old man Cavashir has been scheming his entire life. Although I do not know what he is thinking, I can still guess a little. Seeking life in the midst of death, hee. It is nothing more than seeking life in the midst of death. I wholeheartedly want to throw you out of the imperial capital. I want to throw you far away from this whirlpool that will engulf countless people. That brat called Shaya Laming. Caves Hill thinks so highly of him, so he must have already prepared a backup plan. Only by staying by that brat's side is the safest place. Unfortunately, you don't understand. You don't understand my plan. You only think that relying on hot-bloodedness and recklessness is called courage. Stupid, self-righteous stupidity. At this point, the old Duke seemed to be tired. He raised his hand and wanted to touch the teacup on the table. However, he touched nothing. He then remembered that the teacup had already been smashed to pieces in his anger. He licked his dry lips and looked at Rodi again. You blame me for locking you up at home. Hey, good. When the country is in danger, you, little Minas, will go to the city walls to fight. You want to be loyal to the empire. You want to be a true warrior. You want to personally wield the sword and protect the imperial capital. You blame me, you hate me for locking you up at home, you hate this old man for not letting you go out, you hate this old man for tying you up, you hate this old man for holding you back from the path of your service. Today you wanted to sneak out. You wore the armor that you hid under the bed. You took the sword that I gave you back then. You even brought 18 of your personal guards with you. Haha. Very good. Once you go to the city walls, your sword will draw blood. With your martial arts, you will be able to kill a few rebel soldiers. When the time comes, people will see you and shout, Little Duke of Minas is mighty, worthy of being a member of the Minas family. Hey, that is what you think, isn't it? Rodi was stunned. He opened his mouth and looked at his father. However, he could not say a word. What his father said was indeed what he was thinking. Originally, these words should have been said by her in a righteous manner. However, her father had said it on her behalf. Moreover, he had used that kind of understatement and even a somewhat disdainful tone. Why did each and every word sound so unpleasant to him? Why did it feel like something was wrong? You are young and hot-blooded. This old man does not blame you. On the contrary, I am happy. The Duke of Minas shook his head. Unfortunately, what Cavalier said back then was correct. He looked up at Rhodey and said, "A few years ago, after a banquet, what Cavalier said to you. Do you still remember?" Rhodey opened his mouth and his face suddenly turned red. He gritted his teeth and reluctantly said, "Teacher Cavalier said that I said that I." He took a deep breath and continued, "I am biased and cannot be a commander or a good general." If this comment was made by someone else, with Rhodey's arrogance, he would not even care about it. However, these words came out of the mouth of Cavalier, who had become a legend, cannot be a commander or a good general. If this comment was made about someone else, it would be a rare praise. However, it was made about Rhodey. It was simply scolding him. His father, the Duke of Minas, was a veteran of the Empire's military. He was the true commander of the Empire. However, when it came to Rhodey, he was only a general and could not be a commander. Wasn't this pointing at his nose and saying that he was unworthy? Although that old man Cavalier and I have been at odds for decades, I admire his foresight. Now, it seems that your foresight is not enough. It is too light to say that you are biased. I am afraid that it is only because of me. In my opinion, you are simply stupid. Self-righteous stupidity. As the old man spoke, his tone became more and more solemn. He looked around and saw that there were only the father and son in the house. There were only a few loyal family iron guards outside the door. There was no one else. The old man then sneered. The glory of the Minas family. What a joke. It is simply a joke. You stupid boy. Do you think that I, Lao Tzu, do not think about the glory of the Minas family? Ever since your sister married the crown prince, I've become a coward. I don't really care about military affairs anymore. I've become nothing more than a doorframe placed on top. You say that I am weak, old, and lethargic. Why do you not understand? The one who does not want the glory of the Minas family to appear again is not this old man. It is His Majesty. After the Duke of Minas finally said the last word, he could not help but bend his body as if he was sighing. The glory of the Minas family has reached its peak in my hands. Being a veteran of the Empire's first army, it is already glorious enough. However, what will this glory become after it reaches its peak? The old man's expression suddenly changed. He stared at his son and said with a cold voice, "Do you really want our family to become like the Tulip family and have no descendants?" Rhodey's face turned pale. He stared at his father with his eyes wide open. The Empire does not need the glory of the Minas family. His Majesty does not need the glory of the Minas family. You did not understand this in the past. Now, do you still not understand? Your sister married the crown prince. This is the line that His Majesty drew for us. It is a circle. Behind this circle, the imperial family will tolerate us. Once we step out of this circle, we will face a calamity. Stupid. Stupid. I told you to read more books and read more about the history of the continent. Can't you see the knack for it? The old duke shook his head. Since the founding of the empire, apart from the period when the empire was founded, which emperor would allow his relatives to lead the army? You do not understand His Majesty's intention. Your sister has become the crown princess and will become the empress in the future. As long as the Byzantine Empire is not destroyed, our Minas family will not have to worry about wealth. However, we will never be able to command the army. Yet, your head is filled with hot-blooded thoughts of serving the Empire. Do you not understand that our Mina's family will never have anything to do with the army again? You were dissatisfied with that marriage back then. I understand that you thought I sold my daughter for peace. Humph. The old Duke shook his head. During the war against Odin last year, you knelt outside my study for an entire day and begged me to throw you into the army, to the north, to the front lines. However, I did not do as you wished. Instead, you became even more unrestrained. You ruined your own reputation by drinking, fooling around with women, and causing trouble with those debauches in the capital. I thought to myself, forget it. Even if you really become a debauchee, with your sister and me around, we will be able to protect our family's position. You do not understand, but your sister does. She sees things more clearly than you. Later, when the war ended, His Majesty issued an order and Adrik came to the capital. You went to see Adrik and begged him to put you into the army. You have learned to be smart. You know that begging me is useless, so you went to beg others. However, even though Adrik is a straightforward person, he is not a fool. Sigh. When your sister married the crown prince, you did not understand why. At the beginning of this year, His Majesty promoted Adrik to the position of Minister of Military Affairs. He also promoted 2 of his direct descendants to the position of generals. He created the Adrik faction. Do you still not understand? The Empire no longer needs the Mina's family. This is His Majesty's intention. Rhodey was stunned as he listened. He stared at his father. He looked at his old father as if he was talking to himself. There is no need, there is really no need. Haha. Do you still remember? The night before Adrik took office, he came to see me. He is my student. However, he stood outside the door for an entire night and I did not see him. He only bowed to our door and asked the gatekeeper to pass me a message saying that he understood. Only then did I feel gratified. Even though Adrik is straightforward, he is smarter than you. He understood that His Majesty promoted him to replace me. Father, I do not understand. His Majesty. Rhodey stuttered. What do you not understand? Why did His Majesty abandon the Mina's family and promote Adrik to the throne? Why did he not promote me, a ready-made veteran in the army? Or, why don't they nurture a rising star like you? Duke Minas smiled, but his smile was a little deep. He stared at his son and took a deep breath. The last 2 sentences made Rhodey's heart tremble violently. Think about it carefully. If His Majesty promotes Adrik to the throne, he can promote someone else to balance him out. At that time, he can promote Salambanili or choose another loyal noble family. Even though Adrik is in the limelight, he is not as prestigious as I was in the past. If he is promoted, the imperial family also has the power to restrict him. However, if His Majesty promotes our Mina's family, in the entire empire, where can we find someone who is qualified enough to compete with me and restrict me? Plop. After hearing this, Rhodey, who was originally kneeling on the ground, suddenly sat back on the floor. He stared at his father with his eyes wide open and could not say a word. If you want to blame someone, blame yourself for being born in the Mina's family. Do not mention the glory of the Mina's family. Just because your surname is Minas, it is best that you do not touch any military power for the rest of your life. This is your mission as a member of the Minas family. The father and son looked at each other for a long time. However, this time, there was no longer a trace of passion in Rhodey's eyes. All that was left was a deep sense of loneliness and dejection. Finally, the sound of hurried footsteps could be heard from the corridor outside the door. A servant wearing a warrior's robe quickly ran in. When he entered, he had a dignified expression. Your Excellency the Duke. Outside the door, the Duke of Minas's face darkened. He looked at the servant and coldly said, Didn't I say that no matter who wants to see me, I will not allow them to enter? After the news of the defeat of the southern reinforcements the previous night, the people of the empire began to relax. Many people began to think of ways to make a backup plan. Seeing that the Byzantium ship was about to sink, there were those who were loyal to the empire and those who were willing to die for it. However, there were also those who had other thoughts. The warlords in the city had already been purged. At this time, it was very difficult to establish a connection with them. Some of them suddenly thought of Duke Minas, the Grand Elder, after thinking for a long time. Whether it was the survival of the empire or the rebel army entering the city, the lives of others might be in danger. However, the old duke was as stable as a rock. It was for no other reason than the fact that the old duke had been in the military all his life. He had an outstanding reputation in the military. Even many of the former governors of the rebel army had once served under the old duke. Some of them even had a teacher-student relationship with the old duke. Even if a disaster was coming, the old duke would still be a way to survive. Since the previous night, many people had come to see the Duke of Minas. However, the old duke ordered the door to be closed. No matter who it was, no one was allowed to enter. After the servant who came in was reprimanded by the old duke, he quickly whispered, "Your Excellency, Salambanili has sent someone. The one who came is the eldest son of the Prime Minister." Salambanili sent his son? The Duke of Minas was startled. He immediately felt a strong sense of uneasiness. When others came to see him, they might just be asking for a way to prepare for the future. However, Salambanili would definitely not do that. The Sorum family was the leader of the aristocratic faction. They were absolutely irreconcilable with the warlords. Others might waver, but Salambanili's only way was to continue on with the Byzantine Empire. There was no other way. "Where is he?" the old duke subconsciously asked. "He has already left." The servant lowered his head and replied, "The Prime Minister's son only came with a message. The Prime Minister entrusted him to pass it on to you. What is it?" The servant's face was filled with awe as he said, "The Prime Minister said that His Majesty has already, what is it?" The old duke suddenly stared. His majestic aura made the servant bow down. He quickly said, "His Majesty has given him the authority to control the city's defense." The Prime Minister said that His Majesty does not understand military strategy. That is why he wants to hire young Master Rodi to be his military advisor. When he heard this, the old duke's face suddenly turned pale. He took a few steps back as if he wanted to sit down on a chair. However, when he sat down, he found himself sitting on nothing. His mind was in a mess and he awkwardly fell to the ground. The old man subconsciously tried to get up. However, when he moved his arm, he suddenly opened his mouth and spat out a mouthful of blood. Rodi, who was originally tied up with the rope, cried out in alarm when he saw his father fall and vomit blood. He shook his arms, and with a few crisp snapping sounds, the rope was immediately broken. He quickly rushed to his father's side and carried him to a chair. He then laid him down on the chair and quickly wiped his chest to soothe his breathing. "Father! Father!" The Duke of Minas opened his eyes. There were traces of blood on his beard. He looked at his son and took a deep breath. His voice was weak as he said, "Help me up, father, you just vomited blood," Rodi said anxiously. "Bastard!" The old man suddenly glared at Rodi. The light in his eyes was so dazzling that Rodi did not dare to look at him. "Help me up!" How could Rodi dare to disobey? He quickly helped the old man to sit up straight. The old man closed his eyes and remained silent for a few seconds. When he opened his eyes were shining however. His face had become increasingly pale. "Prepare the horses and gather the men. Bring my robes. Also tell those fellows outside to leave. If they do not leave, use a stick to beat them up. Scatter them all. Quickly." The old man quickly gave a few orders. The servant was still hesitating when the old duke snorted and said, This is a military order. The servant immediately straightened his chest and saluted. He then turned around and strode out with a murderous aura. It was obvious that the servants of the Minas family were all former soldiers of the Duke's army. His Majesty has authorized Salambanili, the Prime Minister, to hire you as a military advisor with no authority. The old Duke looked at his son and asked, "Do you know what this means?" Rhodey anxiously shook his head. "It is to entrust me." The old Duke's eyes suddenly burst into tears. "His Majesty, I have to go. Today's 2 chapters have reached 10,000 words. Is that enough for me to repay you? Please give me some votes. I do not dare to think about monthly votes anymore. Please help me cast more recommendation vote. I really want to pull myself together. I will try my best to write more in the next few days. As for the voting, I ask for everyone's help. How much you support is up to you. Please." To be continued. If you want to know what will happen, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Nights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.